Stefan Wul à mort, Vivante Anticipation. Fleur Noire, Paris, 1958. Première partie, chapitre 11. Depuis des siècles et des siècles, l'homme avait émigré vers les planètes paradis. Les lointains systèmes autour du soleil ne graviteront plus que des mondes presque déserts. Seul Vénus hébergeait une société organisée, relief de l'ancien empire. But 3/4 of science had been lost. Artificial hostility towards scientists was accelerating this decline further. They were content to use old recipes handed down from the past, but recognized as safe by a timid theocracy. As for Earth, it was the cursed planet. It was forbidden to touch it. Moreover, its gloomy and hopeless climate was sufficient to keep away the curious. Only those without scruples dared to venture there. They evaded the space police's traps and traded in terrestrial antiques, which were still in high demand among some depraved people. Science was tolerated on Venus, but the consistory, chaired by her high prudence, was responsible for keeping her within harmless limits. Similarly, in the past, certain tribes of Africa had tolerated in their midst the presence of blacksmiths, necessary to rural economy but suspected of maintaining a dangerous trade with fire spirits. This the people of Venus did not know, any more than they knew of Earth's proto-history. However, regarding scientists, they still had instincts of the same nature. Some researchers could attain high social positions and be respected citizens, but the average man continued to see them as dangerous jongleurs. Fortunately, the priests were there. Joachim, the master biologist, would receive a visit from the priest inspector every month. Joachim was finishing dictating his monthly report to the fixed phone. The entrance bell rang. Joachim pressed a button and took a look at the screen. He saw the face of the priest inspector. He left his work and walked down the corridor to go open the door. Certes, he could have opened the door without leaving his desk. That was how ordinary visitors were dealt with. But for his vigilance, that would have been incorrect. He had to open it himself. The inspector entered and made a gesture with his finger. He said, "Raise your brow, Master Bio." Joachim interrupted his customary bow and hurried on. "How's your vigilance keeping?" It was an odd sight, that elderly man with a white beard doting upon the young man in the shoulder sash, a priestly insignia that commanded respect. "Very well. Thank you," said the inspector. "Shall we go to your office? Do you mind?" Joachim beat him to it, saying, "I'm just finishing my report. I'll be done in 2 minutes, your vigilance. Thread theme." Joachim continued, It seems undeniable that the same laws apply to higher vertebrates, and there doesn't seem to be any reason why man should be an exception. Going no further, we dare to hope that the consistory will rule in favor of bolder experiments, perhaps on birds. He fell silent and reversed the recording handle to unwind the thread in the other direction. The inkjet. Joachim let out a sigh. "It's done," he said. The inspector had furrowed brows. The biologist waited for him to please open his mouth. "You go far," the inspector said finally. Is it pleasing your vigilance? I say you go far. You're talking about man. I'm afraid these words are bordering on incorrectness. Joachim waved his hands. The great being guards me from forming any bad intentions, your vigilance. These are nothing but words expressing a scientific hypothesis. To touch on the embryo of man is a sacrilege. I know it. I feel horror at the thought that. But from word to deed there is a long way, isn't there? Undoubtedly, undoubtedly. But this sentence is unfortunate, and the consistory will be unpleasantly influenced by it. I don't know if experimentation on birds will be granted to you. Joachim extended his hand towards the fixophone. Do you want to hear since the beginning? No. No. Just give me the real. It will be listened to in time and place. Summarize your work of this month for me quickly. The scholar opened the apparatus and handed the roller to his visitor. He tucked it into his handkerchief and crossed his fingers in an expectant attitude. Joachim coughed. Here we go. I managed to induce a normal frog from a nucleated egg, then renucleated by the nucleus of an ordinary cell taken from an adult being. The donor cell came from a simple epithelium. Translated from your scientific mumbo-jumbo, you took the nucleus of a normal egg. You replaced that nucleus by that of any cell taken from another individual. The egg was perfectly content and continued to grow to give a toad. A frog, if you want. To give a normal frog, and this frog was a twin of the frog that gave it. Without saying a word, the young inspector priest had pulled a file from his towel. He seemed to be looking for something. Joachim got worried. What will he find again? I wish for the other. The other. It was the old, kindly inspector who had died 6 months earlier. This young man had taken his place. The other, always rounded corners, tried to be as little pedantic as possible and humanized instructions. But the new one showed himself unyielding, though without malice. He displayed the zeal of a beginner. Here we go, he triumphantly exclaimed as he put his finger on a page of the file. Joachim had a heart attack. Here, repeated the inspector, I read this in your last sheet. Permitted to continue genetic experiments on fish. Yes, your vigilance. About fish, 1 point is enough, Master Bio. And you are brazenly talking about frogs. You have exceeded your rights. Yet it's true, thought Joachim with irritation. I barely read the last sheet. The other would have been content to laugh and add in the margin the word batrachian. What stories for a frog? It's an aquatic animal, he dared. Come on, Master Bio. Beavers are also aquatic animals. I dare not think of the reactions of the consistory if you had groped baby beavers without official permission. But, as it is presented, your case is bad enough. I am sorry, your vigilance. I am an old distraction. What course do you think? We will certainly destroy your jars of experiments in the presence of designated witnesses. I dare hope that her great wisdom— The two men bowed. Will not be too severe with you, the inspector concludes. And now let's say the prayer. You seem to need it. They recited together, their foreheads bowed. O great being, protect those who must dip their hands inside. Keep them within the limits set by her great wisdom. Keep them away from excessive curiosity and dangerous temptations. Joachim lifted his head, but realized that the priest-inspector was still holding hers forward in a reverent attitude. He did the same and kept an eye on the moment when it would be pleasing to his visitor to stand up straight. The inspector finally seemed to emerge from his meditation. He held out his hand. Give me the key to your laboratory, he said. Oh yes, perfectly your vigilance. This severity exceeded his darkest predictions. He obeyed anyway, and the inspector went to close the laboratory's door and put the key in his pocket. He had a small protective smile. "Let's hope that the council will return it to you soon," he said as he left. "Don't sin any more, Master Bio." After a final farewell, Joachim shut the front door and stood motionless, gazing at it. Tears of impotent rage shimmered in his eyes. He finally shook himself and threw himself into an armchair, head in hands. "Science," he said aloud. "Science isn't so bad. Science isn't so bad. Without science, Venus would never have been habitable. These are scientists who regularized its climate formally." Although very angry, he had the impression of blaspheming, while an inner voice told him, without science and scientists, Earth would still have been habitable, and man would not have needed to emigrate. On Venus, one did not utter the name of the cursed planet without risking it. It was a vulgar word. Joachim had a burst of childish revolt. He shouted with all his might, "Long live the Earth! Long live science!" Then, worried, he ran to the window to see if anyone had heard him. A bell rang, cutting off his words, and he turned pale. He feared that the inspector priest would return and quickly checked if he hadn't forgotten his towel. "No! Who could pay him a visit well?" he whispered. "Oh, forgive me, grand being, I pray." Chapter 2. A smiling man was standing at the threshold. "Am I in Master Bio Joachim's presence? May I have an audience with you?" "He has heard," thought the scholar. He must have heard. Then out loud, "Well, yes. Enter, citizen, go ahead and enter." He guided his visitor to the office and invited him to sit down. The visitor was still smiling. Joachim had time to think that he was showing himself far too friendly for, no doubt, a simple representative. But the fear of having been surprised in full blasphemy upset him. Already the man blinked and said with a rogue's tone, "Long live the Earth and long live science, Master Bio. I came across a scholar devoid of common vulgar prejudice. Think." Joachim felt the ground give way. Staggering, he leaned on the back of a piece of furniture. He couldn't see straight. Now, said the impassioned voice. "Don't be afraid of me. I have a soft spot for infidels. Long live Earth, isn't it? Can you see this, old scoundrel? Get out." The man demanded that I not be troubled, to chase after the inspector who is leaving here, no doubt. I am sure he's full of humor. It shows on his face. Your exclamation a moment ago would have made him laugh uproariously. Joachim recovered himself. Pride restored his dignity. So, he's bad. I am a sworn expert, and I would like to know who the inspector will believe, you or me. You have dreamed, my friend. The man kept silent for a moment, but without losing his diabolical smile. Then he appreciated. "Well played. You have spring in your old bones. But admit that you don't want to see the inspector again today. Perhaps he would believe you on your word, but there would still be a slight hint of it, which would be very unpleasant to him. There would be a small note of danger under your name in the files of the consistory. They would certainly keep an eye on you." He swept these displeasing remarks aside and added, "It was just a joke, Master Bio. I have no intention of acting like that. A single thing interests me. To sell you my goods." He tapped on his swollen pocket. "Guess what I've got here?" Joachim shrugged. "I couldn't care less, citizen." "Let's end your mysterious airs. Pull out your dust-gathering brush, your pressure cooker, or I don't know what else. Tell me your price and get the hell out of space. You don't believe me, Master Bio. I am not an ordinary representative. I don't sell small household tools. He took a square object from his pocket and threw it on the desk. The object didn't look very new. The scientist touched it with his disgusted finger, then leaned forward, as if hypnotized. But it's a book, Terran, the visitor finished. A Terrian book dealing with organ histology. Joachim withdrew his hand as if he had burned himself. The man took the book again, opened it at random, and read out loud. In the intervals between the seminiferous tubes, there are large epithelioid cells full of enclaves. Their nucleus is clear, with a large nucleolus, and their cytoplasm contains crystalloids and some lipoid droplets. Of course, all this is absolutely incomprehensible to me, but I think you will find it fascinating. Let's go on. He turned a few pages and read, "The adrenal gland is an endocrine gland with multiple functions. She has an antidote role by either binding or destroying a tetanizing poison that forms by the muscle contraction." Joachim was opening his eyes in a hallucinatory fashion. The visitor read on. "The study of the white substance comprises several methods. Golgi's method, the scalpel dissection method, and the development time method. The fibers of the various bundles are not myelinated at the same time in the embryo." And Joachim had a childish gesture. He ripped the book from the visitor's hand, saying in a hoarse voice, "Give it to me. How much?" "Very dear, Master Bio, very, very dear." "It doesn't matter," said Joachim by cradling the book against his chest. "How much do you want?" 100,000 Valers in cash. "I don't have that amount here." The unknown man reached for the book. "Until tomorrow," he began. "No, wait," Joachim exclaimed, taking a step back while still not letting go of his treasure. He rummaged through a jewelry box and returned with a diamond necklace, which he offered to the man. He then pulled out a loupe from his pocket and examined each stone carefully. He jumped the gem in his hand and said, "All right, but that's only half the price." "Wait," Joachim said with sparkling eyes. He was gone for a few minutes and returned with bundles of money. "Count it," he said. The man counted, gave a satisfied nod, and sent the bills to join the necklace in his pocket. He got up. "It's a pleasure to do business with you, Master Bio," said Joachim, pushing him almost into the corridor. "I'll be back," said the man. No, goodbye," blew the scientist. "Goodbye, Master Bio," said Joachim. Joachim slammed the door and locked it double. He still clutched the book to his chest. He went to check the window locks and pulled the curtains. Then he plunged into the pleasures of reading, too passionately to remember that the night before he had despised those who bought terrestrial objects. He had never thought that this impious contraband could trade in anything but forbidden drinks, licentious art objects, or canned drugs. He forgot his troubles with the inspector and the consistory's wrath. He sinned shamelessly and without remorse. This book taught him very little about histology proper, or rather the histological results, but about old scientific investigation methods. He drew invaluable information from them. He read very late into the night and fell asleep with his head between the pages, drunk on science and abomination. Chapter 3. As the inspector predicted, the consistory took action against Joachim's initiatives. His laboratory was prohibited for 6 months, and he had to spend all his mornings at the temple, so that he could be purified in prayer. He didn't care much about it. لكنه كان يفكر فقط في تلك الليالي الممطرة التي قضاها مع الكتاب الملعون. He soon knew it by heart. When the smuggler returned to knock on his door, he could not defend himself from welcoming him to buy new books. Little by little, he got used to the company of this bandit, who reassured his conscience by telling him that the letter of religion was made for simple people and not for scholars. He also claimed that even priests had sought his help, and that he would not have been surprised if the young inspector had taken a bite out of the forbidden fruit. "Dear Master Book," he said, "you are very naive. The consistory libraries hold more earthbound books than you will ever read." Quoique perverti, Joachim s'en scandalisa. Est-il possible? Sa haute prudence lit à l'ouagie des ouvrages semblables à ceux-ci, renchérissait le contrebandier en frappant de la main sa dernière livraison. Hibernation, le nouveau-né, il ajoutait avec perfidie, la seule différence entre vous. Leads yourself to pleasures that cost you dear without a pearl. Let's go further and imagine for a moment that you are denounced. Joachim had a hiccup and cast an anxious look out of the window. Your books would be confiscated and burned. Not at all, he said. They would simply be put in storage in the libraries of the consistory quite safely. This kind of interview gradually sapped the morale of the master bile. He became a free thinker on the end of a life so far irreproachable. One day the trafficker seemed more nervous to him. His perpetual smile had something forced about it. Joachim made this remark and asked him for the reason. "It is because," said the man, "my organization has charged me with a difficult mission." "Your organization?" "Yes, master. You don't seem to think I work alone. Smuggling requires capital, men, equipment, organization. I'm just a cog in the wheel. In brief, I have to convince you to go to Earth." "Is this a joke? You will have at your disposal masses of laboratory books, as you have never dreamed of them, and the right to indulge in the most daring research. No inspector or consistory will hinder your genius." Joachim believed he was well perverted, but from perversion to criminal madness there is an abyss. A shiver of horror ran down his spine. "You may not count on that," he said. "You will have at your disposal masses of scientific books, and this time without it costing you a cent. It's the great chance of your life. Do not let it fly away." "No, it's impossible," said Joachim, trembling. "I don't want to see you any more. You dragged me onto the fatal slope. Now I realize it. Your proposal is abominable. Is that you speaking, Biomaster? I thought you were free of all this official superstition. We have laughed about it many times, both of us. You're afraid of priests. Oh, don't worry. Everything is taken care of on this side." "No," Joachim repeated while wringing his head. "I am afraid of priests, that's true. But I believe I'm even more afraid of you. You're a demon." The trader broke into laughter. "So, you've stayed put? That's incredible. I thought you were a naive but intelligent man." The old man glared at his torturer. He saw him as he was on his first visit, frightening and sardonically. Anger and contempt sculpted satanic folds on his pale face, weather-beaten by long stays in an astroship. He was a spy of hell, a pariah, a cursed one. He should have never let him into his home. It was the terrible punishment of the great being. Everything began with a blasphemy. He shouted, "Long live the earth!" and Satan immediately knocked on his door. The scholar recovered himself, though. He regretted having given in to childish imagination. He shrugged. "Listen," he said, "you're wrong about me. Try to understand me. I don't believe in Prudence's religion, it's true, but my childhood and all of my life have been marked by rituals and taboos that are still playing their role as brakes. My intelligence shouts at me that you're right, but all my flesh is bristling at the thought of such a journey. My flesh commands. I'm too old. Find someone else and don't come back. I won't rat you out. I could not do so without condemning myself as well. The visitor's silhouette stood out against the last rays of the setting sun at the window. Straight and with his arms crossed, he seemed like a statue of contempt. "Understand me," the old man repeated. The other spoke. Unlike all expectations, his tone was conciliatory, with just a hint of irony and familiarity. "I understand you, poor old Joachim. In fact, I knew your reaction in advance. Unfortunately, I can't come back empty-handed. We needed a biologist on Earth. But Earth is empty," stammered the scholar. "Yes, Earth is deserted. But not quite. Our chef needs a biologist." "Why?" "For his daughter." "His daughter? He has. I don't understand." Joachim grew increasingly suspicious. Throughout his career as a biologist, he had been approached on numerous occasions for all sorts of incredible things. These were old girls who wanted a child without a father, women of the world who wanted to entrust the burdens of motherhood to a jar, madmen seeking a change of sex, misfits who asked him to perform monstrous operations on them. He feared something like this. "To save his dying daughter," the trafficker added. "What's this girl's age? She isn't a girl, but a 13-year-old child. What is she dying of? She was bitten by a poisonous beast." But at last Joachim exploded. "I'm not a doctor. We want a biologist. A doctor couldn't do anything. And not just any biologist. You, the boss, knows your works. I refuse. Leave me alone for the last time." The smuggler cast a glance outside. He remained silent. She seemed to be waiting for something. Night was falling. Frightened by this attitude, the scholar opened an armoire, rummaged through piles of folders, and brought out the cursed books that had cost him so dear. He flung them onto the desk with the volume he hadn't had time to open. "Take it all back. I don't want it anymore." His visitor finally spoke, in a soft voice. "You can keep the money." The visitor then spoke, in a gentle voice. "I've been ordered to bring you back by force, my old Joachim." He took a step and pulled a strange weapon from his pocket. A kind of very sleek-barreled pistol. Joachim received. "Don't be afraid," said the drug dealer, taking 2 more steps forward. "Some knobs don't kill." "They just paralyze." "No," shouted Joachim. There was a small hiss. The man had shot him full on. Joachim fell against a wall. A tiny frozen drug needle was melting under his skin, paralyzing all of his muscles. Awakening with a start, and stiff as a board with wide-open eyes, he saw his attacker put the gun back in his pocket and bend over him. The man picked him up in his arms and managed to get him into a chair all right. Then he went out into the corridor and opened the front door. He whistled into the night on a low note. A long car soon pulled up outside the house. 4 men came out. The smuggler dragged them into the house and pointed to the motionless scholar. They carried him silently outside. On the way, the attacker cordially hit the elderly man on the shoulder. "Excuse me for breaking into your room, Master Bio. I'll pack your bags." He picked up the cursed books and handed them to his acolytes. "Well, take them along, too. They're part of Joachim's comfort." Chapter 4. Lying on a bench, Joachim felt the car zooming down unfamiliar roads. From time to time, lights flashed across his face as they passed through towns. Then it was an interminable straight run, no doubt over a main trans-state highway. He fell asleep with a vague feeling of horror and unreality. He woke up in a loud clatter and saw himself lying on a stretcher being carried by 2 men. They were in a noisy corridor filled with the sounds of engines and machine pulses. A door opened. Joachim was made to lie down on his belly on an oddly soft bed. He felt his legs and arms being tied. The light went out. The door slammed. he was alone. For hours, he heard walking in the corridor, sensed brief orders, creaking, wheels on rails, shady laughter, steam hissing or whatever it was. The smell of hot paint made him nauseous, and then other smells came, strange ones, and as if they were imported from another world. The sounds decayed and all gradually fell silent, except for an unbearable pizzicato that seemed to count fractions of a second, and the hissing very close to a fluid in a pipe system. Suddenly, his ears buzzed. He felt himself sinking into the softness of his cot and lost consciousness. The following days were a long night. He had fierce headaches and pains in his limbs. Alone in the dark, he sometimes stayed for hours with, in his insides, a feeling of terrible fall. Stained by colored lamps, he felt himself being tickled and pricked in the armpit. His teeth were loosened to make him swallow insipid or painfully strong liquid. He heard distorted voices due to partial deafness, affecting one ear or the other at times. For moments he had the feeling that they were spinning him around at high speed or that he was floating slowly up to the ceiling, and then gently bouncing from one partition to another, like dust in a glass of water. He was just a sick body. When his heart beat too fast and too hard, it was all his heart. It was no more than a huge, painful heart that beat, and risked exploding at every moment. And this monstrous heart sometimes slowed down, spaced its pulses, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, until it touched death, too. At other times it was nothing more than a gigantic thirst, while all its cells craved for some liquid. Terrible delusions made him do absurd and terrible things. He was hot. He was cold. It was a massive itch. One day he was a hand, a giant and stiff hand where movement had ceased. Then he became nothing. Finally, he woke up in an immobile room. And this immobility was almost painful after so many dizzy days. He sat on a gray-draped bed and realized he was not alone. A woman with ebony hair, a tragic beauty, stood by his bedside. Tall and slender, she stared at him unblinking with her vast eyes. Her skin was as white as snow, and so thin it seemed slightly purple around the eyelids. She waved her hand to draw the folds of a long black satin cloak around her. Joachim saw a ruby sparkle on her finger. "Who are you?" he asked. She paused and confessed. "I'm the one who brought you here. We're on Earth. In the Puris." "The Puris?" "Yes, an elongated chain of mountains that rises from the ocean over 400 kilometers. She spoke in a low, harmonious voice with worry-filled inflections. Her features expressed no emotion. There seemed to be a hint of anxiety in the depths of her dark eyes. "Are you the leader?" asked Joachim. She slowly nodded and simply said, "Rest. You will be taken to the castle tomorrow." With Joachim's eyes still conveying a question, she clarified, "At home." She emerged, closing the door gently behind her. "I'm on her." Joachim grumbled painfully. He dare not move any more, barely breathed. He felt that everything around him was nothing but filth. He slowly turned his eyes towards a circle of light to his left. A sort of skylight, through which filtered a dreary day, was crackling with a continuous shower of rain. Someone knocked at the door and entered at once. It was his kidnapper, with his perpetual smile attached to his lips. He was carrying a pile of books under his arm. "Well?" "Joachim," said he in a cheerful voice, as he put down the books on a small table. "Are you free of all your emotions? I should hate you," the doctor said. "Which means that you don't hate me." "I am very touched." Joachim shrugged. "A new life begins for you, Master Bio, an exciting life. Soon you will bless me." He made a gesture towards the table and added, "Here, I bring you new books, more recent than the others. I intended to sell them one after another. Be glad. You have them for free." He reached out his hand to his gored victim. "No hard feelings, Master Bio." Joachim turned away from him. Undeterred, the dealer cordially slapped his shoulder. "I bid you farewell. I'm off to Venus in a few hours. We'll meet again maybe someday. Try to be in a better mood." For hours Joachim watched the window where clusters of drops were crashing. In the evening someone came in and turned on the light without saying a word. Joachim didn't even turn around. He heard a faint noise of dishes, and a scent of cooking hit his nostrils. When he was alone, he realized that a sumptuous meal was waiting for him on a tray. He got up and, looking around himself, saw a kind of suit laid on a chair for him. He put it on and picked up a book from the table. He flipped through it idly, then sat back on his bed, transfixed by the interest of the text. He became engrossed in it and, without realizing, stole the plates of food that had been brought to him while reading. Chapter 5. The next day seemed like a dream to him. Strangers made him put on boots and gloves. He was dressed in a large waterproof and transparent cape that gave him an unreal appearance of a ghost. He asked about the reason for this outfit. "The rain is dangerous," someone replied. This was the longest phrase he had heard since the previous day. Men did not speak to him except in monosyllables. They themselves dressed alike and communicated with each other in a fast, distorted language by an accent difficult to understand, in which he grasped only one word here and there. He was pushed out beyond a heavy door, and the rain pounded on his waterproof coat. Clopin clopet. 3 men accompanied him along a muddy path and made him board a sort of rope wagon. They took seats beside him on uncomfortable benches, and the vehicle began to climb toward hidden summits, veiled by gray rain clouds. The higher they went, the more they found themselves in the midst of thick clouds from which, every 5 minutes, metal pylons emerged. Despite his efforts, Joachim could not get a feel for the landscape around him. His eyes, focused on the ground, only saw rocky slopes and, occasionally, a large rock, painted by moisture. He shivered within his clothes. Soon the funicular entered a tunnel at whose end a tiny light was flickering. A bell chimed, the sound reverberating under the vault. The light seemed to approach. It was only an amber lamp above an iron bridge. The carriage stopped. A bit higher up, the cable engine threw out a purple spark. The lamp appeared to be going out, and its light flickered for a moment like that of a candle. Joachim was brought down. His boots echoed on the metal floor. A door opened onto a staircase. At the bottom of the stairs waited a nightmare being, armed with a whip. He was a very thin man, with an entirely bald head. The corners of his lips were scarred by scars. But the most horrifying feature in this face was the absence of nose and ears. On either side of his skull, his auditory apertures were merely 2 black holes. 2 holes, too, the double respiratory slit deprived of nasal appendage. One of Joachim's guides opened his mouth. "Don't be afraid of Ugo. He is a good boy despite his ugly appearance. He had a serious accident once." Ugo gurgled. The huge apple of Adam climbed up and down several times the length of its bare neck. "I warn you that he is mute," continued the guide. "He expresses himself by gestures. Let yourself be led." He got back into the wagon, which swayed a little under his weight. The engine sputtered again. The car went down towards the tunnel exit. Ugo had already given Joachim an inviting gesture toward the stairs. Shivering, Joachim passed him and started to take off his waterproof cape. But Ugo touched his arm with the handle of his whip. He signaled to stay dressed. They climbed a few steps one behind the other and reached a cement landing. Ugo gently pushed the scholar into a hut and turned a button fixed to the wall. A shower of warm and steamy water fell on Joachim, who, on the monster's silent orders, carefully rinsed his boots and gloves free of any trace of rain. Assured, the monster invited Joachim to follow a little further. He helped her undress in a small wardrobe, where he himself changed his shoes and washed his hands. Then he led her through long corridors. At every crossing or turn of the labyrinth he swung his whip in front of niches regularly carved into the wall, and Joachim thought he saw something moving at the bottom of one of them. At a certain fork in the road, the biologist knew what these niches housed. He saw, tethered by the neck like a guard dog, a spider the size of a calf, standing on its hind legs in the middle of the path. The beast was more aggressive than the others, so Ugo had to snap his strap twice. The first zap zapped a long pelage across the spider's thorax. Hairs flew, angry. The insect snapped its claws and pulled on its chain. Ugo gurgled as he took a step back. The second strike seemed to slightly disarticulate one of the animal's front legs, and it staggered back into its lair, horrified. Joachim squeezed his guide tighter as they passed through the dangerous spot. Ugo led him through a series of bare, daylight-lit galleries and rooms, their long windows casting a sad light. Their footsteps echoed endlessly. A scent of old stone and wood worked by the centuries hung in the air everywhere. Finally, the earless man pushed open a colossal door that creaked upon turning on 2 notes. They entered a warm room, where 2 meters of fire crackled below an armory of strange signs. 3 high-backed chairs were the only furniture in the room, along with some sort of fur-covered pouf placed in the corner of the hearth. Ugo invited Joachim to sit down. He himself walked towards the pouf, and the scholar thought, until the last moment, that he was going to sit on it. But Ugo lowered himself and scratched the fur on the handle of his whip gently, as if it were the back of an animal. The pouf released a kind of irritating squeak and unfolded 8 articulated legs that spread out around him like a star with shivers of pleasure. It was still a spider, but without a leash. She seemed tamed. Ugo giggled and went to lean on at the door. He didn't notice Joachim's pale, crisp state in his chair. However, the beast was folding its legs under it and regaining a harmless appearance. Chapter 6. A step could be heard on the paving stones, and the woman whom Joachim had seen the day before entered through another door. She had an air of sad nobility and seemed even more beautiful to the scholar than the previous time. She said, "Thank you, Ugo." As a perfect servant, Ugo bowed slightly and left the room. The woman took another chair opposite Joachim. She noticed his weary features. "You look tired," she said. "No," said the biologist. "No, I." He cast small glances at the spider. The woman understood. She ordered, "Vanda, get out of here." The beast lazily stretched and hesitated. "Come on," the woman insisted. The beast, with a look of regret, walked towards the door and disappeared with a painful clanking noise, like a big mechanical toy. "Calm down," said the woman. "Vanda isn't dangerous." But Joachim dared hardly breathe. He expressed his thoughts in a racing tone. "It's hell, madam. You've drawn me to hell." "You're wrong, Master Bio. You'll soon get over these little repellents. It's just a matter of habit." The scholar clenched his fists on the armrests of his chair. He leaned forward. "What exactly do you expect from me? Say it quickly." "I'll finish my task as soon as possible, and you will give me my freedom, won't you, Mrs.? "Call me Martha," the woman replied. She gave a slight smile to add, "So what do you call freedom, Joachim? Here, no priest-inspector or high prudent. Finally, when I don't need you any more, you will go back to Venus or stay here. At your pleasure." Joachim cleared his throat. "May I know, is your daughter sick, as I've been told?" "My daughter is dead." He repressed a sob before adding, "She died during your journey. You don't expect a resurrection, do you?" said Joachim after a brief pause. Science has its limit. The beautiful Martha clenched her jaws, and then, "Yes," she spat violently. "Or rather," she shook her head and spoke more quietly, "a kind of resurrection. I have carefully read old books. They talk about human grafting. You, Joachim, you have succeeded in the experiment on mollusks, and then on amphibians. I ask you to try it on my daughter. I know you can't bring a corpse back to life, but you could create a new being that's as much like my child as possible. A delayed twin sister. So that's it," said Joachim slowly. Admitting that such a thing were possible, it would still present a formidable ethical conundrum. Was it right to tamper with the sacred springs of human life to create a being without parents? The scholar felt the conscience that was engendered by his Venusian training stir within him. An idea struck him. He said, "I understand very well what you are demanding of me today, but when you had me killed, your daughter was still alive. What did you expect of a biologist?" "The same thing. I knew that she wouldn't last much longer. I would not have asked you to prevent his death, but to ensure the life of some cells. Then, too late." "But yes, Master Bio, I took tissue samples everywhere. A finger, an intestinal fragment, a lung, a spinal cord." Joachim looked into Martha's eyes. This enumeration had something horrible about it, coming from a mother talking about her child. He searched for a word, found an approximate one, dissected it. The face of Martha remained closed like that of a statue. She said, "I'm very well informed on all these things. Old books have helped me. The samples are safe in glycerin at low temperature. I've given us every possible advantage. We have enough cells to do thousands of experiments, because each cell can make me a little girl. And even if the success rate is 1 in 1,000, it still leaves us with a comforting margin." Joachim put his head in his hands. "I've never done that. You will. On Venus, it was your most cherished desire. Confess it. You're finally rid of the priests." Joachim shook his head. "You don't realize, Martha. I found a way to give a genetic shock to living cells. Only the male cell was preserved at low temperature. Where will you find an egg? My daughter was 13. Master Bio. It's a bit young, but I have what it takes. Trust me. And if every piece of flesh is a holder of seminal virtue, the old books claim one can get female gametes from simple ovogonies, and even from polar bodies. I took my precautions on this side." Joachim was astounded at the young woman's knowledge. In a nutshell, it was about putting together a living thing from 2 cells taken from a corpse. And this living being would be both father and mother at the same time to the dead girl. It would look like the little girl who had died right down to the last detail. Viewed from that angle, the experiment deserved the name of resurrection. "That would be satanic," Joachim repeated several times. Yes, it would be satanic, but already in his mouth, this expression was no more than an empty word. The scientific passion swept away all scruples and any religious memories from him. He could no longer hear the crackling of the fire in the fireplace, nor the howling wind somewhere at the end of a hallway, nor the annoying click of the spider's footsteps in the adjacent room. He felt no longer on Earth, nor on Venus. He was up to his neck in the dangerous biology kitchen of yesteryear, but he still asked, "Have past Earthlings tried this experiment, or has it remained theoretical?" "They carried it out successfully," Martha replied, "and nothing bad has ever come of it. Believe me, Joachim, your religion exaggerates by banning all science. Many of them were very helpful." The scientist asked again. "Do you have a laboratory?" Martha nodded. She explained, "I actually have an assistant, Ugo," he guessed. "No, me," she exclaimed. Heaven guided by Ugo or Martha, at random as the need arose. Joachim knew in a few days the masters of the castle. At least the habitable part, for some galleries ended in debris and others had been blocked with boards. He also learned to avoid the unsafe stairs and the trap of the portcullises that overlooked the void. He didn't need to warn him about the labyrinth leading to the funicular. The memory of the guardian spiders was enough to make him sick of it. Anyway, he never dared venture alone outside his apartment. 2 small square rooms covered in books, which on one side opened onto a toilet room set up in a pepper grinder, and on the other into the lab. This was a large room with a vaulted ceiling. Long tables laden with bizarre glassware surrounded it. Test tubes and coils of tubing were scattered everywhere, even on the sort of stone dais at one end of the room. He was told that this dais was an ancient altar, and the laboratory a chapel of the old faith. Before he began work, he demanded changes and ordered tools that were missing. All he had to do was speak, and Martha would comply without arguing with his wishes. His first night was terrible, disturbed by the sinister song of the air currents, the meowing of nocturnal birds, and the distant tinkling of a bell, swayed by the wind in the loft of a tower. When, overcome with fatigue, he had slept for 5 minutes, it was to wake up in a cold sweat, his heart pounding. He then heard the clatter of Vanda's paws as she chased rats down the hallways. She got one just behind her door. And the rat's agonizing cry froze his blood. The following nights were less uncomfortable. He does not sleep anymore, because Ugo made a terrible noise in the laboratory by sawing boards and hammering to modify the electrical installation. But this hard worker in the next room was enough to chase away his first fears. Despite his head of nightmare, Ugo was a man. Joachim abused himself with reading, sitting in bed. From time to time, his lamp would flicker. He knew then that the funicular was delivering something, and he could hear Ugo hurrying to receive the visitors. He could be heard receding into the labyrinth, cracking his whip on the slabs of stone. The next day, by magic, Joachim found a new device, microtome, calorimeter or cardiographic control panel standing on a table made according to his plan. This lasted for months, because Martha brought the equipment from Venus. Gradually, Joachim got an idea of the fantastic power of the organization financed by smuggling. He was surprised that Martha, with such resources, did not live more comfortably on a nicer world. He asked her the question, but she only answered with a vague smile. He knew nothing about her, her past, her family, or the circumstances that had brought her to head of the company. She lived alone with Ugo and Vanda, sequestering her youth in this building from another time, under a gloomy, rainy climate. Why? She seemed to enjoy solitude, for no one ever crossed the corridors leading from the funicular to the habitable wing. One day, Joachim heard her giving orders by phone about God knows what export of art objects, and it was undoubtedly extraordinary circumstances, such as the arrival of Joachim, that led her to descend into the buildings 1,000 meters below. During her forced nights of watchfulness, the biologist studied the earth. She found old atlases and marveled at the ancient shape of the continents. Today the oceans covered everything, Only the highest mountains emerged from the mist and desolate fog, whipping constantly by waves and hurricane. He had no trouble locating the Poras, site of his strange retreat. With dictionary blows and map comparisons, he found their old name: the Pyrenees. He didn't uncover without discomfort the origin of this nomenclature. Pyrenee, daughter of Bebrix, king of Iberia. Seduced by Hercules, she gave birth to a serpent and fled, to escape her father's anger, into the mountains that separate France from Spain. She was devoured there by wild beasts, and her name was given to these mountains. Everything was unhealthy and worrying on earth, and the oldest legends carried within them a poison for the mind, a dangerous morbidness. Joachim opened up to Martha about these personal thoughts. She found them true, but rather than being scared by them, she seemed to enjoy them secretly. Secretly. It's true, she said. The earth seems cursed. One day we'll have a few hours of good weather. That happens once or twice a year. I'll take the opportunity to show you a bit around the pores. You'll see. Everything that used to be pleasant or useful has disappeared, killed by the radioactive poisons that this planet is saturated with. On the contrary, unpleasant or harmful species seem to have drawn new strength from this radioactivity. No flowers, but giant nettle or dangerous plants. No singing birds or butterflies, but big slugs as big as an arm or spiders like Vanda. There is even worse. It's strange, isn't it? She had remained there, a strange smile on her lips, and excused herself to go about her business. What business? Curious girl. One night, Joachim heard her sobbing in the corridors, calling her child. This is the translation of the provided text from Otto to English. This is how he learned the name of death. Lise, Lisette. Where are you? Lise, my little baby, answer me. Somnambulism? Perhaps. Unless some sort of madness. Joachim drove that thought away. Another time he was woken in a cold sweat by a dark harmony. It was at the other end of the castle, like a musical hurricane blowing through 100 different brass instruments. A vibrant and cold symphony with counterpoint of spring-water arpeggios and demure stridings. The next day, Joachim asked the origin of this gigantic and beautiful noise, terrifying as the chaotic heart of 1,000 gods and demons gathered together. "It's my organ," said Martha. "I like to play it." Org, his barbaric name, was unknown to the scholar. He imagined a monster with 100 mouths wide open, a sort of metal hydra alive, made to sing the tragic glories of the cosmos, or full voice, all the fears and sufferings of hell. To escape all these hallucinatory sensations, he lost himself in study. The cold, impersonal reasoning of the old scholars served as an antidote to his sick imagination, which was too nourished by monsters, wind, night creaks, and noises from beyond the grave. He tried to forget that everywhere the fog clung to the windows like cotton, isolating the castle on a world itself isolated. He grew accustomed to Ugo, and didn't even lift his head when Ugo entered his room early in the morning to throw a bunch of wood on the coals from the previous evening. Joachim buried himself a little deeper under his blankets, closed his books and his eyes. The smell tickled by the smoke made him fall asleep, and he made up for lost sleep in 2 hours. Then the great heat woke him up. He looked for a moment at the high flames dancing on their log platform, and he got up to make a toilet in the tower. In the beginning he had examined with suspicion the water running into his sink. Was it not radioactive? But Ugo assured him by gestures, and Joachim supposed that there was a filtering system somewhere in the castle. He stepped out into the laboratory one morning and felt a thrill of pleasure. Everything was ready. The stage was set, and all that remained was to strike the 3 blows. He had no idea what the consequences of his attempt would be, nor did he imagine that he would upset and then destroy humanity in order to bring it back in a terrible form. Amid the vials, long white tables with sinks and microscopes, Joachim felt at home. Familiar smells of disinfectant pushed away any old apprehensions. Martha herself seemed transformed by work. Previously she had presented to the scientist the appearance of a mysterious princess, a priestess of a cursed religion. The simple port of a white blouse made her into a pretty student, and, though perhaps a bit too serious, she had humanized herself. They began by examining all the tissue samples taken from the child under the microscope. They divided them among different test tubes. Joachim fixed his gaze on a tiny piece of aborted follicle. He placed it in a plasma stream and carefully heated it by 1 degree every 2 hours. However, the plasma flowed along the glass tubes and passed through various spectroscopic checks monitored by Martha. Various droppers and various filters corrected here and there. Its contents are in salts, hormones, diastasis. Hours passed, long ones made of stationary observation and exhausting, barely interrupted by short thoughts. Instinctively, Martha and Joachim spoke softly to each other. Every now and then, the biologist would recite a figure, and Martha would adjust the rheostat slightly. They waited for a transformation in the tissue, which would have confessed a resurrection, but the regular intervals of microphotos revealed with despair the same image. Joachim was first defeated by fatigue. He went to lie down for a few hours while Martha remained impassive at work. A hand shook Joachim's shoulder. He opened his eyes. Martha was in front of him, very pale. Joachim's mouth moved, but no words came out, and he didn't understand what the young woman was saying. She repeated, "Cells stratify." Joachim jumped out of bed and ran to the microscope. He compared what he saw with the previous photographs. There was no doubt in his mind. The tissue was alive. Cells were multiplying around an oocyte. A burst of youthful joy colored the old man's forehead, while a tear slowly rolled down Martha's cheek. The scholar consulted the notes he had taken while reading the old books. He added various stilligouts to the plasma circuit. For days and nights they labored tirelessly, watching the oocyte grow, transform into an ovule. With fever, they grew more tissue samples. They barely ate and slept. And Martha worked twice as hard as Joachim. A parthenogenic egg could have been possible to obtain, but the biologist preferred to introduce into the ovule, with a very thin pipette, an intestinal epithelial nucleus. It was the big moment, the critical point of the experiment. As they saw the 2 nuclei join, embrace, and accept each other, they fell into each other's arms. They were no longer an old scholar and a young woman, but 2 companions united by a wonderful emotion. But if proud Martha should reappear later, this friendly embrace would leave with Joachim. He still didn't know it. A more troubled memory, tinged with platonic and loving affection. Day after day, they saw the egg transform, round out. Once, Joachim caught Martha leaning over the jar. She whispered words of affection to this little aquatic thing. She called Lise the unconscious seed born of her dead daughter. But soon, the biologist became alarmed. Things were moving too quickly. An accelerated chaotic growth was making the embryo bud. It should be expected to have twins. Martha didn't seem over-surprised. She even seemed satisfied. His satisfaction became apparent after a few weeks, because it turned out that he wasn't going to be born 2, but 10 individuals. She confessed that she had intentionally caused the embryo to sprout while Joachim was asleep. "An accident can happen," she said. "I want multiple copies. But if they all come to term, you'll have 10 little lisps." Joachim objected. "We'll see." However, the biologist was afraid of the growth rate. In 6 weeks, the twins took on the appearance of 3-month-old fetuses. They had to be separated, and 10 jars, lined up, each carried its little red flesh frog curled up on itself. In 2 months, 10 faces, fully formed, wriggled. Like Inquiet's puppets, the twins waved their small fists closed. 7 of them grew bigger. The other 3 remained desperately immobile in their glass coffins. The plasma of their circuit became cloudy, their flesh soft and bloated. Ugo took upon himself to go bury them somewhere. At 4 months, it was necessary to face reality. They're at the end of their lifespan, Joachim confessed. How will you be able to care for 7 children all at once? Everything is taken care of. One morning, indeed, Joachim stumbled upon a formidable woman sitting in a corner of the laboratory. She had the prostrate attitude of a buffalo at rest, a massive head and broad mouth, giant feet and hands. The biologist questioned Martha about the look. "Her name is Zona," said the young woman. "She'll take care of the kids. Isn't that right, Anna?" The other opened her mouth in an idiot smile and replied in a singing tone, "Oh, but she's a Martian half-breed," said Joachim. "Where did you find her?" "It doesn't matter. She'll be wonderful for this kind of work. 10 children at a time would not frighten him." "Oh, no," said the mulatta. His vocabulary of mental retardation was limited to those 2 words. But she soon proved that she knew her job. She grew animated when the twins were pulled one by one from their plasma bath. Indeed, Joachim appeared embarrassed as the first baby was in his arms. The half-caste lifted him up gently and swung him back and forth twice. The baby cried. In a trice he was oiled, swaddled, and put in the first cradle. She did the same for the others with efficiency and regularity as a machine. Then she set the heating of the small beds, lowered the hoods, and pushed them outside into the cold corridors. She seemed to have 10 hands, as her gestures were so rapid and precise. She thus took 4 twins at a time. Ugo and Martha followed with the other 3, while Joachim washed his plastic-gloved hands. When the biologist turned around, he was alone in the lab. He walked towards the door and cast an eye down the empty corridor. He felt abandoned and a little miserable, useless after completing his mission. Thinking, he took off his gloves and threw them in the sink. Then he went out and strolled around Martha's apartment block. He stood for a few minutes in front of the heavy door, hesitating. He could hear the distant wailing of babies. He dared not enter and turned back. In the laboratory he was very alone with the empty vials. Mechanically he set about putting everything in order, but the feeling of a presence made him turn his head. The spider Vanda had taken advantage of the open door. She began a slow and careful tour of the room. The sound of her articulated legs was unbearable to Joachim. He made a big detour to avoid the beast and went to lock himself in his room. He tried unsuccessfully to fall asleep. Then he walked back and forth for hours. From time to time he took a book and read 2 pages while thinking of something else. Then he would throw the volume on his bed. The loneliness was pressing on him, so he cautiously opened the door to the laboratory. He searched for Vanda with his eyes, and first thought she had left. Then he saw her on a table. Crouched in front of a jar, she was drinking the plasma, slowly stirring her feelers, like a witch tracing ritual signs to consecrate some horror rite. "Don't know." Disgusted, Joachim shut the door. Ugo came looking for him as the evening fell. Martha wanted to see him. She stood straight and proud in front of the blazing fireplace. This was no longer the young student that Joachim had known a few months ago. No more white lab coat, but a dark, glittering dress falling to the ground, and triumph shone in her dark eye. She looked the biologist in the face and simply said, "Thank you, Joachim." She coughed and said, "I'll be fine. I'm sorry, they're well." She tilted her head silently. Then she said, "I'd like you to stay a little longer. I may need you. After that, do whatever you want." Joachim realized he had been brusquely dismissed. He knew it by the surge of joy that flooded his old heart. He had to admit it to himself. He no longer wanted to leave. Second Party, Chapter 1. For many weeks, Joachim tried to continue his research, but he worked in a scattered fashion and began too many things at once. In fact, he felt lost because of the loneliness. He would sometimes go 8 days without seeing Martha. He only saw Ugo, who regularly brought him a tray at mealtime. He tried to talk to the man without ears, but he was stingy with gestures. Outside, winter had come with its snow draperies and frost decorations on the windows, and during those interminable afternoons, Joachim dozed in front of the slow fall of white flakes. He felt empty and aimless, spurning all books with disgust. The magnificent success of his experiment had mentally sated him. He knew little about twins. Martha was not very talkative about them. "Are they well?" "Very well." No. Joachim always kept his last question to himself. A certain feeling of injustice towards him. He waited for someone to invite him to visit them. One day, Martha entered his house. In her pale face, her eyes seemed a little too big, as if enlarged by some kind of fearful surprise. She said one word. "Come." Joachim immediately realized that something was wrong. He followed her in silence. In the heavy mirrors of the corridor, he saw her biting her red lips nervously. They passed through the large door and into the grand hall, which the biologist had already seen. In the next room, Joachim spotted the organ. He recognized it, though he had never seen it before. But the fantastic voices that had haunted his nights could only come from this tower of giant whistles and pipes. He didn't have time to be surprised. Already Martha was dragging him through a row of smaller rooms filled with tapestries and antique furniture. They finally entered a room where 7 cribs were lined up. The scholar first thought that these had been adorned with ribbons that swayed gently in an air current. He approached and opened a gaping mouth in astonishment. The ribbons were made of flesh. Each little girl extended her arms beyond the cradle, and these arms twisted and elongated like snakes. At the end of each arm, a little pink hand was waving like a starfish and struggling to touch, on either side, the hands of the other twins. They seemed to want to form a chain. Joachim looked at Martha. The young woman had her eyes on him already. He read an imploring and desiring look in them that touched him. He had the urge to hold her close, as a comforting father would his daughter. But Martha wouldn't be content with vague words. She wanted to understand. "It has been a long time?" Joachim coughed. "No, I came to see you right away." The doctor approached the cribs again and took a small arm. By palpation, he easily delineated the contours of the fragile, tiny bones, but the skin and joints had stretched in a terrifying manner. Between the humerus and cubitus, there was only a flexible cord. Joachim brought the cradles closer together, and the little hands fought each other out, interlacing themselves. The chain was formed. The arms regained their normal size. During the phenomenon, the children did not stop sleeping. Joachim pointed at her lips with a finger and dragged Martha into the next room. "I must say, there's nothing really scary about twins. You know their reputation. They're always seeking to stay together, as if regretting the promiscuity before their birth. I have to admit that, from a physiological point of view, this poses a problem. don't understand how members can stretch like that. No, Martha interrupted. Don't try to soothe me with cheap words, Joachim. These children have something abnormal about them, and you know it well. Let's forget what we just saw. There is something else. What then? Their growth. They are only 3 months old, and by their appearance they would be a year or so. In addition, they talk. They talk? What do they say? Oh, childlike banality little things. For example, they ask for food. We're only 3 months old. He mentally cursed himself for not having paid more attention to the first anomalies of the fetuses, because finally everything had been distorted from the beginning. The small creatures had formed too quickly. Corrupted, Joachim muttered. Corrupted by what? Radioactivity? Martha, you've always been too mysterious with me. Consider that I don't even know exactly how Lise died. On Venus, your envoy vaguely spoke to me of a poisonous animal. Which one? A lizard? A big wall lizard? This leads to something, maybe. Imagine if, without us knowing, the venom has affected the composition of the protoplasm, acted on the genes. We did not detect anything in the tissue tests. Do you think we can see everything through a microscope? I have to study this venom, try its action on other samples, and it will take years. The children will give us time to surprise them again with some other acrobatics of muscles or language. You will always be beaten. Who knows? I may have the time to develop a serum that would work after death and cellular regeneration. Why not? We are swimming in the unknown, but everything can be attempted. Martha sighed. Well, Joachim, do as you please. Ask Ugo to catch you a wall lizard. We'll see. Do you think my little daughters are monsters? They don't look like them. They act like them. At that moment, a chorus of small voices came from the next room. The 7 girls were moaning together. I'm hungry. I'm hungry. They sang this short phrase to the tune of a well-oiled lament, without one voice overlapping another. It seemed as if an invisible conductor were guiding their instinctive choir. Joachim and Martha hurried toward the cradles. The children had half-closed eyes. They always held hands. They opened their eyes together and let go of each other's hands. Woke up. They asked for food. In a normal way. In a great disorder of voices and words. One of the mestizo came into the room with bottles full her arm. She handed them out laughing with a foolish air. Martha dragged Joachim aside. It was extraordinary and a little scary, she said. This choir had something inhuman. Joachim shook his head. It's just a simple telepathy phenomenon similar to the need to hold hands. It's strange that this telepathy appears to only act during sleep. When they come to, it seems as if they've regained their individuality. You should watch over them and take notes on your observations. Let me know. Joachim, do something, I beg you. You'll find something, won't you? Chapter 2. Ugo brought a lizard as long as an arm, thin as a snake, with tiny legs in a cage. Strips of various colors ran across its skin. It looked like a flame creature. It kept opening a triangular mouth with menacing fangs. It was necessary to extract his head from an opening in the prison using metal tweezers. He was presented with a cup sealed by a membrane. He bit, and his hooks tore through the membrane. Joachim firmly pressed the edge of the container against the glands. The venom flowed out. When the lizard had bitten several times, Joachim had at his disposal half a glass of an opaline liquid. He began to work on his serum. This took time. And during this long development, the girls continued to grow. On many occasions, Martha had the opportunity to observe their united psyche during sleep. Joachim had talked about telepathy. The word remained imprecise. It would have been better to say sympathy. In an etymological sense. Indeed, the twins felt pain, amusement, pleasure, or fear at random in their dream. If one of them uttered a word or made a gesture, the other 6 uttered the same word and made the same gesture at the same time. They had kept the habit of holding hands. Out of curiosity, Martha had tried very hard to get them to give up this habit. She quickly gave it up, unable to see without a sense of malaise how the arms of her daughters stretched out like serpents meeting each other at their ends. The little girls continued to grow at an alarming rate. They ate enormous amounts. Their minds also grew in wisdom. In short, they appeared to be 2 years old at 6 months, with the language and intelligence of 7-year-olds. Aside from that, they played and babbled like all little girls in the universe. They quickly learned to read and spent long days devouring all the volumes within reach. They drew on a chaotic and poorly digested body of knowledge. At first frightened by their intellectual precocity, Martha took some solace in the fact that they were more attuned to the incantatory value of words than to their deeper meaning. Then this taste for incantation itself troubled her. On their apparently innocent rounds, the 7 girls, for example, sang, "Candy Castle, you will melt your glucose, will spread she eeks, H12, O6 sing of the deeps," or using an old priestly scarf as a jump rope. "The rope is long and brown, going from man to the living God. The ancient race is lost. Jump a step out of non-existence." Martha took away the scarf from their sacrilegious hands. She asked, "What are you singing there, little fools?" "A song. I hear it well. But what does it mean?" "Nothing." "Where'd you pick up these words again? Do you even know what they mean?" They fell silent, looking guilty and embarrassed. They would take refuge in a corner, hold hands, and whisper stories to each other. From time to time, they would all giggle together. Their great pleasure was also to play tag with the spider Vanda. This spider seemed to fear them, as though they were the plague. She usually stood as far away from their games as possible, and would snap her hooks in bad temper when one of them got too close. This fear was an excitement for the little girls. They spent many long hours tracking the giant insect. Disobeying Martha, they left the apartments to run up into the attic through the creaky stairs. But Vanda always eluded them thanks to her great agility. They also exercised their young wickedness on Ona the half-breed. But this never lasted very long. They danced around her, singing Ona the silly. But the mulatto was content with a foolish laugh and calmly waited for the end of this unpredictable game, which the girls quickly grew tired of. A fine morning, they seemed to have lost their usual turmoil. They all clung together and refused to eat. To all Martha's reprimands, they answered in chorus. "I don't want to." Martha tried in vain to get them to say more. They didn't confess the reason for their distress. When someone knocked at the apartment door, they started crying and trembling. When old Joachim came in, their cries redoubled, and they ran into another room. Joachim spoke. "I succeeded, Martha. We'll act when you want." The young woman then understood the girl's fear. This time, it was really telepathy. They had felt at a distance the scientist's intentions towards them. "I propose," said Joachim, "to try my serum on one subject at a time." Martha asked if the intervention presented a danger. The scholar made a gesture of ignorance. "On normal children, no. But in the present circumstances, I don't know where we're going." Dejected, Martha went to look for a little girl. Joachim heard her steps and voice recede. "Where are you? Answer me when I call you. Where are you hiding?" Have you seen them?" "No, on." Martha would soon be back. "I can't find them. They must have hidden somewhere. Help me." They searched in vain through the apartments, but soft footsteps and furtive noises seemed to come from the upper floor. They had had to get out by a way known only to themselves. Martha rang Ugo and gave him orders. He nodded silently and climbed the stairs with a soft, sure step. Then there were wild chases above the ceiling, followed by frenzied wails and moans. Ugo came down with a little girl in his arms, struggling like a young devil. The other 6 followed at a distance, weeping hot tears and repeating over and over, "I don't want to. I don't want to." It was difficult to push the mourners out of the laboratory, and it was necessary to put their little sister to sleep. When she became calm, Joachim undressed one of her arms, exposed a large vein, and pricked it with the syringe he had prepared. As soon as the serum began to flow into the girl's circulation, her sisters were heard to run away in a scream in the hallway. A little later, they were found in their room, silent and trembling, with a frozen, sweat-covered forehead. It was impossible to get a word out of them. These painful scenes had terribly tormented Martha. That evening, Joachim had a serious conversation with her. "I propose to keep the child away from others. If our test gives results, do you think it will?" "Do I need to repeat that I don't know? Such serum would probably save a child bitten by a lizard. It would have saved little Lise whom you lost. But there we only try to suppress in the chosen child certain worrying phenomena. After assuming that these phenomena were due to, I know not what pollution of the protoplasm by poison, we try to suppress the effects of this poison. We did not have time to study thoroughly the consequences of our resurrection experiment. It would take many human lives. We can only strike by chance. And now, listen to me, Martha, we have embarked on a crazy thing from the start. We were both off balance. You by grief. I by an extraordinary change of life. But let's talk about you. Your desire to bring Lise back to life without missing your chance has led you to make the embryo sprout up unnoticed. And I cannot blame you, since 3 fetuses died in jars. Your precaution was legitimate. Now we must talk sense to you a little. You have here 7 abnormal children. We are now convinced, aren't we?" She nodded. "If my serum or any other means succeeds in making you a normal Lise, what will you do with the others?" Wait. Don't answer right away. Just think about it. I don't want to influence your decisions. I'll only ask you, if I succeed, to concentrate all your affection on the normal child. You had 1 daughter, Martha, and I see every day that your maternal love is exhausted, disperses, and loses all control of itself. You don't know who Lise is anymore, nor do you have the right to betray her memory by profaning her remains. You're spinning desperately in a storm of contradictory feelings, where fear dances with love, and the memory of a bereavement blends with the joy of 7 births. You're lost. Well then, let me repeat to you, you will not find your balance until you polarize all your feelings on a single girl. For the moment, let's work with determination to save that which sleeps under the guard of Ugo. In the laboratory, Chapter 3. The child slept 2 days. When she woke up, she smiled at Martha and asked for something to drink. Joachim opened a tin of milk. After she had drunk, She wanted to get up to go play. "With your sisters?" asked Martha. The girl trembled like a leaf. Martha was concerned. "Well," she said, "what's going on? Do you have somewhere that hurts, my little Lise?" Joachim noted with satisfaction the use of the first name. Martha, in fact, pronounced it for the first time in a long time. A kind of shame and embarrassment had always prevented her from calling Lise the Seven Twins. She seemed to recoil at the necessity of choosing a first name for each. But today, "Where do you hurt my Lise?" The child shook her head, tears in her eyes. She repeated that she felt fine and wanted to play. "What do you want to play?" "To look at pictures." It was a very calm game. One couldn't have dreamed of anything better for convalescence. We installed her in a large armchair with colorful books. Slowly, smiling and happy, she placed her little finger on the images and asked for explanations. Playing with the girl, Martha seemed to swim in happiness. She laughed, joked, kissed her found child. Sometimes her eyes rested on Joachim. He was deeply troubled because that look had humanized itself for the first time in a long time. That gaze expressed much more than the brief thanks she had uttered after the twins were born. "Well," said she suddenly, "don't stand there like a statue. There are pictures of Venusian animals I don't know. Come closer. Explain to Lise how the red crossbill builds its nest." And Joachim, too, bent over the book. But he spoke in a hoarse voice filled with emotion. He felt like Lisa's father. In fact, he was her scientific father, and he and Martha made up a quasi-marital couple. For this old laboratory ascetic, it was the discovery of very strong and very soft feelings. Already, while monitoring the plasma vials, he had felt linked to Martha by shared work. But today, this link was strengthened by the presence of Lise. A male face and a female face, bent over the same child, took on the value of a symbol. At one point, Martha's hair brushed his cheek. He pulled away as if from a delightful burn. He straightened up and leaned back in the large armchair. Apparently indifferent, he had a revelation. He loved the young woman. Given the age difference, he could never confess his feelings to her. He felt something big and painful expanding in his chest, a kind of stoic pleasure that numbed him. He would always stay close to her, loving her silently. He would try to play his role as father and platonic husband to the end. And didn't he have the best part? Didn't it feel better than physical love? For the first time in his life, he was wonderfully happy. It was decided that, pending a final organization, Joachim would leave his room to Lise and Martha. He himself would sleep in the laboratory. The following days confirmed the girl's recovery. Joachim thought of the exorcism. She behaved like a normal child and never spoke about her sisters again. A cloud, yet. She began to shake as soon as they mentioned the twins, as if her body instinctively rejected an ancient and monstrous kinship. One night, she began to whimper in her sleep. Joachim heard, through the partition, the voice of Martha pulling her out of a nightmare. He rose on his bare feet and lent an ear to stealthy noises that seemed to come from the corridor. He approached the door and waited, senses alert. Something was going on behind this door. He caught a barely perceptible scurry, then stifled voices whispering, "Foreigner! You shall die, foreigner!" He grabbed a lamp, suddenly opened the door, and swept the corridor with a beam of light. He saw the twin girls in blouses running towards their room. Perplexed, he got back into bed, but he couldn't fall asleep. Several times during the night the scene was repeated. Curses whispered through the door, Lise's gurgling nightmares. Every time, Joachim would rise to drive away the evil children. The next day, Lise's complexion was pale, a sign of troubled sleep. Martha complained about it without much concern. She didn't seem to have noticed the real cause of the phenomenon, and Joachim kept his fears from her. However, He did inform Ugo. And the man with no ears had an expressive and fierce demeanor. He would make a good guard. In the evening, at bedtime, the biologist heard Ugo shut locks all over and pace back and forth in the corridor. He also heard very faintly the twins' annoyed voices. Lise slept normally that night, but during the following weeks she was seen to pale by the eye and gradually grow worse. She was examined without finding any disease. One night, Joachim felt a hand shake his shoulder. Ugo stood before him with a lamp in his hand. He put his finger to his lips and motioned for him to follow. The scientist obeyed in silence. Quickly dressed in a robe, he was guided to the apartments, but Ugo went past the huge door and climbed 3 small stone steps. He pressed a relief on the wainscoting. A pivoting wall panel revealed a sloping passageway. The 2 men walked through and found themselves in a small dim room. Ugo put his finger again to his lips and turned off his lamp. He pulled silently at a curtain. Through a large window, Joachim recognized the twins' bedroom. The window, transparent on one side only, was also the monumental mirror above the fireplace. He had witnessed an odd spectacle. The 6 twin girls stood hand in hand, mid-room in the moonlit room. Their lips could be seen moving in mute lamentations. Ugo opened a small shutter and heard the little girls humming, "You will die, foreigner. You will die, foreigner. You will die, foreigner." Joachim felt a cold sweat form on his forehead. There lay the evil's origin. The twins had sworn a deadly hatred against the one they were separated from. Endowed with supernatural powers, they killed her at a distance, slowly and surely. The scene was all the more hallucinatory because the girls had grown up. They seemed roughly 2 years older than the stranger they called Lise. It was imperative to act. Joachim had a difficult conversation with Martha. Resisting the sacrifice of young girls who had the same face as Lise, Martha agreed to have them give the injection of serum that had so successfully been administered the first time, one after another. She would then have 7 normal little girls, one a bit older. But she would then be obliged to love them all at once. For as Joachim had already pointed out to her, she had only ever had 1 daughter, and this division of an existing maternal feeling risked confusing her affection, perhaps even her reason. The young woman affirmed that she would be strong enough to endure the situation. She would get used to it, all in all, to give 7 different names to her daughter's 7 pictures. But even for this awkward solution, it was too late. Chapter 4. It was still necessary to fight and call Ugo to capture a little rebel. But the battle was much more fiercely fought and ended tragically. It had been a mad dash all over the apartments at first. The twins leaped on the dressers or went under the beds with incredible agility, and when one thought to have caught one of them, the other one would kick one in the stomach at the last moment or fling a knick-knack at their head. When Joachim called Ugo to the rescue, the girls began to scream in unison, "Auna the silly one! Auna the silly one!" And there stepped forward the half-caste girl, with her heavy, stodgy gait. All smile had vanished from her large, sulky face. Her eyes were hard, and her forehead creased like a lioness defending her cubs. The little girls had probably completely subdued his simple mind with hypnotic practices. From his sewed-up mouth, Ugo pushed out a surprised gurgle when he saw the barrier of the mestizo between him and the children. Then, with calm firmness, he took his arm to push him away from his way. The hell broke loose. A large, wriggling hand descended upon the man with no ears with a loud thud. He was seen to retreat a step, then break under the force of a kick to the stomach. A quarter of a second later, he was on the ground, with the mixed-race woman riding his legs and clutching at his chest. Leaning over him, her hair flowing, she spoke right into his face. "No, no, and it sounded like a beast's cry. Joachim was scared. Having seen him carry extraordinary burdens, he knew Ugo to be very strong. The half-caste scared him, but this one, with her loose limbs, suddenly seemed to spin in the air and went crashing at the other end of the room. Ugo had more than one trick up his sleeve. He was already standing and waiting for the second attack. Anna opened a gaping mouth with yellow teeth and howled in an inhumane fashion. She rushed at her opponent, disregarding any tactics, like a beast hungry for kill. Ugo took 2 blows to the head with his boot's point. The bloody-faced half-breed made for a grim sight. She resembled an alcoholic Hercules in the throes of delirium. Gasping, she charged a 3rd time and managed to get her opponent in the throat. She pushed him back about 10 steps, without worrying about the knee blows that came to her belly. Ugo's face was contorted. There was a loud snap. The mixed-race woman swayed slightly on her big legs. Her hands unraveled. She collapsed onto the floor. Disgusted, Joachim looked back and forth between the fallen large body and Martha, standing at the doorway with a smoking rifle in her hand. As for Ugo, leaning against the wall, he was trying to regain his breath. A sea of blood with purplish reflections slowly rounded around Anna on the parquet floor. "Ugo," said Martha in a cold voice, "you'll clean this up." The man without ears tilted his head. He breathed 2 or 3 times, lowered himself onto the large corpse, and turned it over onto his shoulder. Thus loaded, he left the room. The twins had taken advantage of the battle to disappear. A few hours later, Ugo went in search of the girls in the maze of the castle. He returned as the first time with a wild child in his arms. "Let me go," shouted the captive while gouging at his face. "Leave me alone." When we approached the laboratory, she seemed to calm down and said in a quiet voice, "I'm leaving." She suddenly lost consciousness. When they laid her out to inject her with the serum, they realized that she was dead. She was deliberately dead, and the other twins were dancing behind the door, singing, "Well done, well done." Ugo suggested that he go and get another one, but Martha stopped him with a gesture. "It's no use," she said. "They're going to die one after the other." "I see only one solution." "Which one?" asked Joachim in a weak voice. "I'm going to leave with Lise. I want to keep her safe, far from the influence of her sisters." She gave orders over the phone. The funicular came to pick her up in the afternoon. She was carrying her sick daughter wrapped in several blankets. "I'll be back," she said to Joachim. Ugo would keep him company while she was gone. She followed Ugo, who was balancing a heavy trunk on his shoulder. With her head down, Joachim went into the lab. The fog only let in a small amount of light through the windows. The lights were on. When the biologist saw them turn yellow, he knew that the train was descending. He felt desperately alone. It was a relief to hear Ugo and his whip-cracking return. In the absence of Martha and Lise, he relived the torments of his first nights in the Porres. It was no longer the spider Vanda who disturbed his sleep. "This hasn't been seen for a long time. She must have hidden somewhere, away from the twins who were chasing her." The 5 small survivors were unbearable. Totally free, they walked everywhere, on their night rides. You could hear them laughing here and there with a little dry and grating laugh. One could hear them whispering, rushing down the stairs, singing absurd songs, skipping and clopping in the guardroom, where they had drawn a complex game of similes with it. Talk. Cielo, inferno, purgatorio, grande e piccola cosmo. One also saw unknown words they had sinned in the old books there. Shashasrara, Ajna, Vishuddha, and magic signs that were completely incomprehensible to them, resembling knots of snakes. This strange game had several pieces as accessories. A human backbone, a die, a piece of pottery, a bell, and some coins from an ancient current. All night long, Joachim could hear the squeak and creak of joists and floorboards. Sometimes he heard the scratching at his door and the soft humming. "You've missed your chance, Joachim, you pedantic old man." And still, they laughed and raced around wildly. They'd gathered round the organ. They had begun to play with a finger, and the scientist would often wake up in shock, his eardrum rattled by one or two high notes, followed by an infernal cacophony. Then, very talented, they played by instinct, and their 10 agile hands drew fantastic symphonies from the 5 keyboards. They composed airs of incredible beauty that did not belong to this world. But this beauty had something unbearable about it in its grandeur. And Joachim spent hours with his head under the blankets to escape cascades of sounds and chords that turned his brain upside down. And the screeching voices sang in chorus, "What matters is the distance and the stars in bloom. The speed of thought surpasses light. No matter the suffering, and our mother weeps thought's force, will thunder down on the stranger." And this clumsy song contained a less obscure meaning, for once. It held a terrible threat against the stranger, the little Lise that Martha was trying to protect. The twins possessed fantastic powers. They had given many proofs of it already, and they seemed assured of success, way off at a very long distance. The slow poisoning to death of the normal child. Chapter 5. Martha returned 6 months later, alone. Her long journey had taken her from world to world. She had shown Lise to all the medical celebrities in the solar system. Their diagnosis was always the same. The child was not suffering from any known disease. She had relied on healers, but their unorthodox methods had been ineffective. "Healers," she said. "I have fallen for charlatans of all kinds who infest the great cities of Mars Red. I did not think there were so many of them. I spent fortunes on sleight of hand that produced no effect. One of them, however, had the honesty to tell me that if anyone was going to heal these, it was Shaidan. I asked him who this Shaidan was. He gave me a complicated address in the suburbs of Deimos town." Martha told that this address was just the starting point for a trail, passing through shady offices and members of cults endorsed by authorities. She had struggled to dispel the suspicion of strange men who took her for a government spy. She had spent a lot of money again. "One night I was blindfolded. I had to dismiss some friends who insisted on accompanying me. If they had come, Shaidan wouldn't have shown up. I was taken to who knows where. I was left to wait for hours in a dim room, and I heard a nasally voice ask me what I wanted. I jumped, because I believed myself to be alone, not having heard a door open. I spoke about my daughter. A small lamp then lit up, held by a hunchback, sort of a dwarf with a face covered by a hood. "Show yourself," said the dwarf. "I'm Shaidan. Along your naked daughter on the table." I undressed Lise and stretched her out. The dwarf approached. With his very long and very pale hands, he felt her little body. Lise was sleeping heavily. This happened to her more and more often, and she was unaware of anything. The dwarf lifted her eyelids, and he started to tremble. He quickly pulled his hands back and hid them in his sleeves, but I had time to see the red and blue tattoos on his wrists, and his green eyes shone through the holes in his hood. I knew that before me was one of the last sorcerers of the ancient Deimos race, a duat, as they are called there. I should have been afraid, but strangely enough, it was him who appeared to be scared. His voice became very hoarse, and he spoke some words in an unknown language. I asked him again if he could save my daughter. "No," he whispered. "She is under the influence of the future forces." As I was vanish any sense to this sentence, he added, "The times have come, Hedaya. The times have come, Hedaya." Balance. Paladin was likely an invocation to one of his gods. And while I was dressing the little girl, he said, "She will die in 7 days." He was not wrong. The last week was terrible. Lise cried out in her sleep, "They are hurting me! Oh, Mother, they are killing me!" This was the story of Martha. She ended it with a sob. Joachim put his hand on her shoulder. "Don't cry. I'm willing to start over again." "Start over again?" "Yes," exclaimed the biologist. "Let's go back to the beginning. We still have the tissue samples taken from the first Lisa. We'll be able to make the serum work before birth directly on the embryo. But this time, no mistakes, Martha. Let's grow 10 individuals if you want. But promise me that you'll keep just one at the last moment. Don't fall back into the mistakes that have already cost you so much." Martha remained silent for a long time. Tired of waiting for a reply to his proposal, Joachim got up. "Think about it." He walked towards the door and stopped abruptly. The 5 twins were standing on the threshold, immobile and silent. They looked at them with hostile eyes. Martha sensed the scientist's hesitation. She turned her head and had a start. The natural pallor of her face deepened. While Stefan Wul was away, the little girls had grown even more. They looked about 13 years old and were a dead ringer for the first lies. "What are you doing here?" Joachim asked in an angry voice. He feigned as if he were going to step on them. Martha leaped out of the chair she was slumped in. She grabbed Joachim by the sleeve. "Oh, no," she said. "Don't hurt them." "I couldn't bear it. They are so awful." The children made a stand against Joachim and ran off, laughing. The scholar shook his head. "I wouldn't dare harm them. They are incredibly agile. Even Ugo himself can't keep up with them anymore. They slipped through his fingers." A few minutes later, we could hear the twins playing hopscotch. They were singing. 3 steps in the air, and back to earth again throw the spine and the black algebra, the bell rings human foolishness. Their game had become surprisingly complicated. The squares drawn with chalk now overflowed into corridors and crossed over staircases. We found all over the walls and stones signs of apparent Kabbalistic appearance or naive and demonic drawings. Sometimes chemical symbols or equations. Charms? At first it certainly seemed like it. But over time, it had become a mix of all known games. For the rules compelled one to jump over some hurdles, stab a dagger in a starry circle, pick up a ring with your teeth, advance at an angle, like in chess night, a chandelier lit above 3 stones. This also included hide and seek, the cat in the tree, the bars, and the jolt. Joachim had surprised the girls in solving actual problems of high mathematics, as if they were playing games, before jumping 2 steps down, a torch in his hand. It seemed that this pastime was not free. The girls appeared to be devoting themselves with fury to exercising their diabolical intelligence in all known sciences. In sum, it was a complete educational game, and of a level more than superior, reserved for monstrous geniuses. Joachim began to think that the bizarre songs they hummed while jumping about from one place to another were not a bunch of meaningless words, but that their lyrics had a value that he, old scholar, couldn't have understood without spending several lifetimes studying. He felt overwhelmed, for example, by what the twins called to each other, "God knows why." Victoria's song, "H on 2 pies, its spin Heisenberg is an old fool delta equal 0. And so no uncertainty with this promptitude, but man always dawdles. They would finish this song with a big cry that generally indicated the end of the game. And Joachim remembered a certain Heisenberg formula. He had carried it etched in his old brain since his studious adolescence. X2, to tell the truth, he no longer quite remembered its meaning. He had long ago taken a turn in his general education toward biology, a discipline very remote from physics. But he knew that this formula expressed an uncertainty principle, and that delta stood for a measuring time. The twins seemed to have so completely digested these knowledge that they juggled with it and offered themselves the luxury of despising it. Their old reading frenzy had died out in a few weeks. One might wonder whether this new lack of interest in books did not arise from the fact that they knew their content by heart. An incident confirmed Joachim in this supposition. He caught them one day in the guardroom. They had lit a big fire in the huge chimney, black shadows around the blazing hearth. They were sitting in a half-circle on the slabs, and as they began to inspire terror in Joachim, he refrained from entering the room. He stayed hidden in the shadow of the corridor, a little behind the threshold, and watched them for a long time. In silence they would get up from time to go take a large log from a pile of wood. They remained a long time examining this log, and then threw it into the flames, chanting something incomprehensible. The low angle of Joachim prevented him from seeing the exact details of their scheme, but he suddenly understood when they sang a little louder. "We will have everything in our heads and nothing in the library." They were burning books and not logs. Furious, the scholar leapt into the room yelling, "Stop!" They then laughed and began to dance around him while throwing volumes at his head. On his knees, Joachim desperately tried to gather scattered sheets from his awkward hands. He received a blow on the forehead from a large in-quarto and passed out. He awoke long after, in the middle of the night, amidst some torn papers and empty bindings, in the reddish glow of the embers dying out. Chapter 6. With Diligence. Joachim and Martha had gotten back to work in the laboratory. The experiment had succeeded a second time, and 10 human eggs were rapidly developing in the vials. 6 weeks later, Joachim used his serum cautiously and with carefully calculated doses. The accelerated growth of the fetuses appeared to stabilize in the following days. "I think we've won," said the biologist. "We'll have perfectly normal children, or rather a child. Don't forget your promise. We'll have to sacrifice the other 9 before they are born." Martha had finally given up her old apartments for good, and always slept in Joachim's room. He slept on the camp bed in the laboratory. The old scientist enjoyed this bitter-sweet, delightful sense of intimacy. A feeling of comfortable sentiment came to him from this relative intimacy. He leaned his head against the wall, and thought that Martha was lying only a meter away from him. And every night he intentionally delayed his sleep to prolong this innocent happiness. He tried to listen for the girl's breath through the thickness of the stone. Sometimes he could hear her turning in her bed or sighing in her sleep. Then he would quietly get up and apply his ear to the wood of the door. One night, while he was keeping watch, eyes wide open fixed on the arch, he heard an imperceptible creak at the far end of the room. Terror gripped him. He very slowly turned his head and saw a slab slowly rise before the old altar. He froze in his sheets, abruptly glistening with sweat. As pale ghosts, he saw a slow and silent procession enter the laboratory. The twins took small steps, holding hands in the moonlight. They cautiously approached the long table where the vials of plasma were lined up. With all his courage, Joachim rose, giving a great cry. He caught his foot on a sheet and stumbled. Delayed by his clumsiness, he found the electric switch too late, and the cold light of the lamps only illuminated an empty room. He rushed to the jars to see if the twins had not touched them. They hadn't had time for that, but a small plastic pipe, ripped, was dangling towards the floor, pouring a mass of plasma in it. Joachim quickly sorted things out, but already Martha was rapidly crossing the laboratory and leaning over the vials. The emotion tinged her cheeks a little, and her eyelids, still puffy from sleep, didn't make her at all unattractive. A soft, disrobed body hugged her faultless form. "What's happening?" she asked in a rushed voice. Joachim was gasping for breath. "The twins," he breathed. "I saw them. They came in here, and they were probably looking to kill the embryos. But what's appalling is that. He leapt violently at the sound of Ugo's keys at the hall door. The man without ears came in, rifle in hand. He stood motionless on the threshold. "Say," Martha said to the biologist. "Yes," he replied, looking absent-minded. He grew impatient. "Say what you saw, Joachim. What scared you? You spoke of something frightening." He swallowed his saliva and said, "They were 10. What?" A dead silence ensued for several minutes. Finally, Martha shook her head. "You've dreamed," she said. Joachim pointed a shaking finger at the plastic pipe which he had to reconnect. The pipe wasn't loose by itself. Maybe. "I admit that the twins got in here, but you saw double, my poor Joachim. What you're saying there is ridiculous." "Over there," repeated the biologist, pointing to the ceiling above the altar. "I'm sure they came in through there, and I'm sure there were more than 5 of them." In silence, Ugo walked toward the altar and placed the carbine on it. He took his whip from his belt and bent over the beam. He inserted the short metal stock into a joint and made a test. The beam rose slightly. He slipped his nervous fingers under the stone and finished opening a square trapdoor. They leaned over the opening. A faint draught of air, with a musty odor, caressed their faces. "Did you know this passage?" the young woman asked a servant. He shook his head negatively and went to fetch a lamp. He sat on the edge of the hole and lowered his long legs inside. He placed the lamp between his teeth. Taking support on the wrists, he let himself slide to the bottom. There he stood, and his shaven head barely peeped above the paving stone. He stooped down, and one could hear him moving further into the depths. In turn, Joachim handed a lamp at the end of a pole through the opening. He stifled an exclamation and pointed something out to Martha. At the bottom, another slab covered the floor. She wore antique characters badly carved. Joachim deciphered without understanding the meaning. Hic periet, pir. Fici. He stitched the consonants of some truncated words seemed to him familiar. "It's probably the tomb of an old lord of the place," said Martha. "That doesn't interest us." But Joachim didn't hear. He insisted on 2 groups of characters. Beber and Peer, and suddenly he stepped back as if struck by a dazzling flash of light. "Well?" said Martha. "Bebrix and Perrine," said Joachim. "Recall the oldest legend of the Porces, Martha." "Perrine, daughter of Bebrix, gave birth to a serp." "Or, I see further down the letters, serp." Martha made a face. "That would have been interesting to people in the past," she said. "But we can hear Ugo's boots grinding against stones." The sound grew closer. The man with no ears soon reappeared, his clothes covered in mold and cobwebs. He made a gesture of helplessness and signaled that the path was narrowing 100 meters further on. It had been impossible for him to pursue his exploration. Joachim showed him the inscription on the slab and asked him to unlock it. Ugo assented with a nod, tried the stone with his foot, found it wobbly, and knelt down to lift it. He succeeded without too much trouble. Sent this enormous weight onto his shoulder, then down onto the floor of the laboratory. She fell upside down, revealing another text that was much worse condition than the first one. Vil el sacrament sanguis in velavum corp, reswag une ligne indéchiffrable, puis sic trans homin regenvent, une autre ligne usée par les siècles. Gens nova, hypoten au fond du trou. Béa une ouverture, rectangulaire de quelques centimètres de profondeur. She only showed rock and a bit of sandy soil that had certainly not seen the light for centuries. Martha shrugged again and turned her head away. She leaned forward, a strange hissing noise coming from the long bench of equipment. She looked at the jars and let out a sigh. The plasma boiled all along the circuit. A criminal hand had pushed the switch of the rheostat, and acrid voices sang abruptly in the corridor, "Thus passes the kingdom of man." And one saw running a good 15 naked goblins who wore some hobs while others went nude. Joachim, therefore, had not dreamed. The learned man threw eyes on the inscription of the slab. A sudden realization struck him. The twins had sung the mysterious 6th line of the song to a conclusion. They seemed to know what it meant, but Martha was already running for the door. Ugo tried to stop her. A sleeve of her light dress gave way, exposing a white arm. Ugo had to handcuff his mistress at the doorway. Outside her she was shrieking in the night. "What have I done to you, accursed ones? Why are you torturing me?" "Martha," Joachim gasped as he rushed to help the man with no ears, for the fight had revealed the young woman's shoulders in a compromising manner. Without caring, she waved her arms and shouted curses. "Go away! Leave the castle! I banish you!" She regained her senses and began to cry softly. Then she took Ugo's hand and she looked him in the eyes. "Kill them," she said. A chaos of conflicting feelings disturbed the wrinkles and scars on his mutilated face. Then, like a robot, Ugo walked through the lab, picked up his rifle from the altar, and disappeared into the vast mansion. Until dawn, Joachim cradled Martha on his chest as gallops could be heard everywhere, shrieks of fear and gunshots reverberating from room to room and hallway to stairwell. At every explosion, Martha's body twitched in a spasm. Chapter 7. The twins had stopped growing. They appeared to be 13 years old, perhaps forever. Since then they had multiplied by some mysterious operation. Ugo massacred dozens every day and could not stop their growing tide. They were everywhere. They knew the countless hiding places, nooks, oubliettes, and secret passageways of the castle. We heard them trot like rats behind the woodwork. They were found under beds and in cupboards. They seemed to never sleep and wouldn't stop gabbling, humming, laughing like irritating croaks. They fled in bands down the corridors, reassembled to dance circles in the guardroom, climbed up into the lofts, and hung themselves on the old bells in the belfry. In fine weather, Joachim watched Stefan Wul run across the roofs. In common agreement, the scientist and Martha waited for their total extermination in order to resume in full peace of mind their experiment. But the man without ears was getting exhausted. From time to time, he entered the laboratory and placed his burning rifle against a wall. He flopped down on a chair and relaxed for 10 minutes while eating a sandwich. Then, reluctantly, he picked up his weapon again and set off on his endless hunt. Most of the time Martha slept, doped up with narcotics. As for Joachim, he was busy among the old books, spared by the twins, and tried to find out what the characters carved on the slab meant. One day, Ugo went looking for Joachim, who was flipping through an ancient book while watching over Martha's sleep. The scientist followed him into the lab. The corpse of a little girl lay on the table. She had received a bullet to the forehead. One of her eyes was slightly puffed up. Ugo pointed something out on her side. The biologist noticed an oblong swollen lump from the hip to the armpit. He looked at the man with no ears, and that man made a sign of ignorance. Joachim felt the still warm body. Under the skin, he felt the clear contours of an odd tumor. Intrigued, He took a scalpel and made a long incision down the length of the corpse's rib cage. He probed the wound and brought to light a kind of elongated fetus. He dissected the tissues with great care and found a strange cross-circulation linking the girl to the fetus. Joachim understood that it was an extraordinary parthenogenesis. He asked for other corpses and had before his eyes all the phases of this delivery. Some girls only carried on their side a small nodule hard to find, others a lump as big as the fist. Finally, Ugo brought her 2 twins of equal size, simply joined together by a soft tissue cord. At the incision of this cord we found no trace of circulation. It was only a very loose and almost bloodless conjunctive. The skin was very thin at that spot. No doubt it was the ultimate phase before separation. And now we knew how the little girls were multiplying. But what were they eating? The cans and provisions stored in the kitchen remained roughly intact. It was necessary to give up understanding. One evening, their din became unbearable, and one could hear Ugo's rifle clacking incessantly. Despite the narcotics, Martha couldn't get to sleep. She was sitting at the edge of her bed, with her head in her hands. Joachim was finishing copying a text covered in scratches. "But what are they up to this evening?" groaned Martha. Joachim threw a look at the windows that were lighting up now and then from distant lightning flashes. "It's probably because the storm is approaching." But he seemed more interested in his work than the twins. His hands were trembling with excitement. He said at last, "I've succeeded, Martha. I know what the inscribed stone says. It's awful. I'm not sure of the details or nuances, but the general meaning is there." Martha looked at him with a kind of indifference. "It concerns us," the scholar added. A spark of interest passed through the young woman's eyes. She stuttered. You're crazy." "Alas, no. I've used grammars and lexicons from the depths of time. This language is older than the oldest known languages. It's not Terran archaic, and not even European. I want to say that it is a local language which has undoubtedly contributed to the formation of the European, but much older. It is a dialect that was born in a province called Latium. I don't know where exactly this Latium was. Probably somewhere on the border of the Mediterranean. Not very far from here, in short." He patted his forehead. It seemed weary and terrified by his discovery. He continued, "I have had much difficulty. Most books are missing pages. This language seems to have been very glorious in ancient times. What does the stone say?" Martha was impatient. The scholar cleared his throat and spoke in a husky voice. "Here perished Pyrrhine, daughter of Bebrix, mother of a serpent. Thus ends the first side. What does this have to do with us? Wait, I've only read the first side. At the bottom of the slate I deciphered this." His voice became more trembling and lower. "After centuries, blood. Here, a word is missing. Blood will return to the bodies of young girls." Martha rose, pale as a dead man. Joachim continued, "2 lines are completely erased, but it is still written. Thus ends the reign of man, and a new all-powerful race. That's it. The last words are in very large letters." He hesitated for a moment and said, "It is strange, strange and disturbing." The day we saw the plasma boil, the twins sang one of these phrases. "Thus passes the kingdom of man." They seemed to know it by heart, and yet this sentence was hidden under the slab, incomplete and difficult to read. "Ah, Martha, my head is overwhelmed by an ocean of questions. Does this legend have a true basis? Were men then gifted with prophecy? And if all this is just a symbol, see how this symbol applies to our adventure. You, Martha, are like Perrine, who had an illicit commerce with a certain Hercules, monster of strength. You allied yourself to this terrible and malevolent force called science to bring forth a serpent, to give birth to these inhuman and monstrous twins. The blood will live on, said the pavement. Would the lizards on the wall be the descendants of the serpent conceived by Pirine? Quiet down, Joachim. Listen. We could hear the continuous drumming of countless bare feet on the flagstones. Ugo's rifle kept going off with a sort of frenzy. Soon, the earless man entered the room and threw his weapon at his feet, furious. He stood there, trembling hands and sweaty face. Adam's apple rose and fell several times in the folds of his neck. He cast a look at Joachim's papers, grabbed a pencil, and wrote a few quick words. He handed the sheet to Martha. It no longer bothers them. My bullets don't kill. I don't understand. They trample relentlessly. They're going crazy. Chapter 8. He picked up his rifle and made a gesture for them to follow him. He walked ahead of Martha and Joachim. They passed by the lab with windows illuminated by the approaching storm. The rolls of thunder shook the glass every second. They got to the guardroom and witnessed a bizarre scene. The nude twins held hands in an endless procession, entering through a door and emerging down a stairwell leading to the catacombs. They walked in silence, their eyes closed, their lips pressed together. Ugo placed the barrel of his gun against the abdomen of a little girl. He pulled the trigger. She continued walking with her sisters as if nothing had happened. One could hardly see on his skin but a small pink spot, surrounded by a ring of gray powder. On his back was another pink spot, a little bigger, and one had heard the ball click into the wood of a floorboard after it had gone through the girl without doing her any harm. The twins no longer needed to flee. Where did they come from? Where were they going? Ugo led the couple along the slow procession. They went up the human current, passed through multiple stairs where the twin chains stretched out, went down, went up again, made several turns under the attics, crossed a terrace, got lost below, and, after many detours that the twins formed the thread of Ariadne, they found themselves in the guard-room. The round was complete. Ugo was nothing more than an impotent rage, but Joachim wavered and Martha chattered her teeth. Their tour had shown them hundreds of children all life. Joachim wanted to say something. His lips twitched without making a sound. He took Ugo's arm and made a gesture that Ugo didn't understand. With effort, the scientist walked towards the twins. He took two thin wrists and tugged with all his feeble strength. He was trying to break the chain. In turn, Ugo advanced. He took Joachim's place and pulled frantically, but the young fingers intertwined seemed glued together, and the chain was slowly dragging Ugo out of the room. He stepped back, wiping his sweat-soaked hands on his pants. Then he made a gesture of anger and went out. Joachim looked at Martha. The young woman was trembling convulsively. Her fixed eyes seemed unable to detach themselves from the children. "Come on," said the scientist in a weak voice. "Let's go, Martha." But as she didn't respond, he stayed near her. An odd murmur arose, as if the twins were rehearsing for a closed-mouth chorus. The murmur grew into a whisper. Syllables, and one could just about make out the young lips moving in almost imperceptible fashion. They repeated an incantation in an unknown language, something like "Faulman, Faulman, Faulman, faster and faster." A fantastic clap of thunder made the whole castle tremble. A ball of fire ran along the chain of people. The light from the chandelier went out. In the darkness, we heard the choir start up again. "Faulman, Faulman." Outside, It seemed that the entire sky was exploding in purple sprinkles. A second fireball rolled down the dozens and dozens of bare legs, lighting up to ecstatic faces with closed eyes in the process. Joachim bit back an exclamation at the sight of the girls all having lost their hair. He had attached a lamp to his chest and held in his right hand some sort of estoc, which he must have taken from a panoply in the apartment. Tenacious in his intention to break the chain, he approached the girls and lifted his weapon with both hands. He struck it down with all his strength between two girls. There was a great flash of light, and the sword seemed to bounce off the ceiling. Ugo collapsed backward. His lamp rolled at Joachim's feet. The biologist picked it up and directed the beam at the man with no ears. Shocked, he showed a horrible grin and bulging eyes and a charred face. Martha let out a full-blast scream, unabated, possibly trying to blast the nightmare away with sound, as one would scatter flames with an incendiary lance. Her voice hit a piercing pitch and broke into hiccups. She swayed in the arms of the terrified scientist. The light came back. The chandelier flickered several times before returning to normal brightness. The twin sisters still advanced with small steps. Their bald heads glistened with rain that they had probably received while walking on the terrace. Their bare feet left wet footprints on the cobblestones. And Joachim had a backward step when he thought that this terrestrial rain was radioactive. He also saw that all these round heads were without eyes, ears, and mouths. They had become spheres covered by a smooth, uniform skin. The little girls had become a faceless mob, and their hands had vanished. Their flaccid arms linked together to form a single long snake without any gaps. Rapid cellular activity was uniting them into a single organism. Fantastic metamorphosis resulting from lightning, venom, the flesh of a dead person, and 100 biochemical chants produced a new being. Joachim didn't want to see any more. Terror choked all scientific curiosity in him. He dragged Martha out of the room, pushed her into the hallways, locked himself up with her in the laboratory. The phone rang, no doubt for a long time, drowned out by the din of the storm. The scientist led Martha to an armchair, where she sank. He went to answer the call. He said, "Yes." And someone spoke to him in this rapid language that he didn't understand. "Speak Venusian?" he asked. "I'm Joachim." He was forced to shout to overcome the din of the storm. Under the rafters, the wind caused all the bells to ring at once. The sound of breaking glass and slamming doors could be heard everywhere. At the other end of the line, there was a short pause. Then, "May I speak to the manager?" "Martha is ill," said Joachim. "Seriously?" "Well, a little bit." This is the translation for the provided text. It's the nerves. The storm. This storm is incredible violence. The lightning seems to be targeting the castle. Is everything okay up there? This human voice, full of good intentions, was a relief to Joachim. Ugo died struck by lightning. Maybe it would be better if you came and got us. It's unbearable. In this weather? It would be almost a suicide, my old man. The wind is going to turn the— "What, you said, Ugo, is dead," repeated the scientist. A crackling fire illuminated all the windows, and the light went out for the second time. The noise was so loud that Joachim didn't hear it. He had the impression of feeling his eardrums blast and fell face down on the floor. He stayed for a while in this position, head between his arms. Finally, his ears pinged. He heard a faint noise nearby. He was very afraid, and got up to look for his lamp with a tassel. He swept the floor with a beam of light. The noise came from the telephone that was swaying on the line, scratching the tiles. He held it to his ear and said, "Hello," several times. He tried in vain to restore communication. He looked at Martha. The young woman hadn't moved. She looked dead. Distressed, Joachim went to touch her wrist and let out a sigh of relief. "Stay here. I'll take care of everything." What was he going to do? He left in a direction without knowing what he had to do, hesitated, finally seemed to make up his mind. He looked for a lighter and lit 3 old kerosene lamps. Then he grabbed a suitcase that had been lying in the corner since Martha's return and threw in some personal clothes and dresses of Martha's that had been kept in the room. "We have to leave," he murmured. "Leave here." He gave a glance at the cold storage closet containing the fabric samples. He took out a little bit of laundry to make room in the suitcase, walked towards the closet, hesitated again, finally opened it and took some test tubes from it. A doubt assailed him. Something was not right. The heat. The tubes were warm. He looked at them closely and made a face. The stoppers had burst under the pressure of the gas. The contents of the test tubes smelled putrid. He threw them into the back of the wardrobe and did not know if this discovery upset or relieved him of a great weight. In any case, the diabolical experience was no longer possible. He put a coat on Martha's shoulders and took her by the hand. She rose obediently, without saying a word. He grabbed the suitcase and dragged his companion away. Imitating poor Ugo, he had tied a lamp to his chest. In the guardroom slithered a snake with human flesh. It was about 30 centimeters thick. Endless, it entered through one door and came out of the other. Drowned by rain, it slid on the damp stones where had been erased the tracks of the morel game. "Don't touch it. Take care," warned Joachim. He helped Martha to her feet, and his heart stopped when the long coat of his companion brushed against the creature. The wet skin stirred with a shiver at the touch. A wave of goosebumps ran down the length of flesh. "All that's left of them," he murmured. "They melted into each other, and God knows what secret life this." He couldn't find the right words. He realized he was talking to himself, and shrugged. He pushed Martha towards the labyrinth leading to the funicular. Suddenly, he was worried for 2 reasons. Would he find his way? How could he keep the giant spiders at bay? But he kept on walking with a firm step. For nothing seemed to him more hideous than what he was leaving behind. He tried to extract from Martha some indication of the route to be followed, but she didn't seem to hear him. She followed him like an automaton. Fortunately, Joachim soon realized that he would not need any help. The floor had been irregular wear from many passages over the generations. It was enough to follow the seemingly most frequented galleries and avoid those where the floor seemed pretty much intact. Moreover, these were much dirtier and easily recognizable. As for the spiders, the first that Joachim met made him jump back, but she was no more than a corpse, an unidentifiable mass of broken limbs, empty as the remains of a lobster. Bending his repulsion, the scientist walked past the empty nest where a chain hung unused. His feet made crackling sounds on the shell fragments. He found the second insect in the same state, then the third, and so on. Was this a massacre by the twins? He hurried his pace, with the firm intention of reaching the funicular bridge and never moving from there again. He would wait there for the men below, worried by his silence, to come and fetch him. He would try to take Martha to a far corner of the universe and make her forget all the horrors of Earth. Third part, Chapter 1. Daybreak was approaching. Spotted, ganted. The man had donned a raincoat and a transparent hood. He stood on the flat roof of a building. Before him, on a tripod, a double long-range sight was pointed at the peaks. A few electrical wires connected this optical instrument to a black square box placed on the floor. The man bent his knees slightly to bring his eyes level with the eyepieces. With both hands, he tried to adjust the device. Not far from him, the roof opened. Another man dressed in the same way emerged from a trap. "Well," he said, "we still can't see anything beyond pylon 13. The mist is too thick to let the rays through." "They haven't called?" "No," said the other. "The line is definitely cut. I'm worried about the chief. Why was Joachim talking for it? Something unsettling must be happening up there. I can't imagine that Ugo is dead." The first man abandoned his instrument. He walked across the roof's concrete, swinging his arms to warm himself slightly. He exclaimed, I've never seen a storm like this. You would have thought it was a bombing, and all the flashes converged on the castle. Joachim must have gone up. I don't know what attracts lightning. The other shrugged his shoulders. Joachim has never asked for electrical equipment. We only delivered microscopes there. You're forgetting those large paintings covered with rheostats and color lamps. I don't see why these things would attract lightning. The other wiped his hand across all those unnecessary assumptions with a gesture of boredom. We'll see. Around them the mist was slowly clearing, revealing metal scaffoldings, sheds, cables that were weaving tragic spider webs in the vaporous sky, with droplets of condensation, slowly sliding like cold, transparent pearls along the strings. One also saw a vast expanse where tire tracks and tracks from tracks wove themselves into the mud. Other men went from one building to another. Double cranes, immobile, seemed like giants with raised arms summoning some god of the poor. Here and there, voices rose periodically, expressing orders. One could hear the cadenced whistles of some maneuver. A little train of wagons came out of a depot, gave a whistle, and disappeared behind pyramids of sealed crates. A big truck with chains on its wheels slowly advanced on the slope of a cement road. It started a hairpin turn and disappeared over the edge of the abyss. We heard him long rattle from the depths, with whimpers that rose up like cries. One of the two men coughed under his hood. "You should see a doctor," said the other. "He was at Gay 2 days ago." So, nothing. Matthias doesn't inspire me either. He gets high as a kite. The boss should have gotten rid of him long ago. Remember the guy who came out of a balaclava last year? He said he was cured. 2 months later, he had a goitre neck and reddish-brown spots on his skin. I assure you that you should insist. Has he looked in your throat? It's just a common laryngitis. Yeah. He interrupted himself, raising his shoulders, and checked his instrument with one eye. Hey, what now? I can see the pillar 20. The boys went down. You can't see the castle, can you? I don't even try. It's too far away. Yes, but it's high up. There may be less mist up there. They kept silent for a moment. One of them said, "Say, how many are there?" They might have gone all the way to the castle. They might have brought the chief with them. Shut up. They only left at 3 in the morning. It's obvious you don't know the mountain. It's barely 5 o'clock. And anyway, I can't see why the chief would have gone down. The storm has passed. Joachim said she was sick. I think she's not herself since her daughter died. Everything is running smoothly by routine, but there is no more courage or initiative. When you ask her to give orders for the field, she responds that she will act exactly as for number 4. You get the impression that she wants to get rid of it. But no 7 is under 1,000 meters of water. It would require much more means. It's an exceptional field. Say so. 10 square kilometers. On found one. It seemed inexhaustible. What was the city's name called? Something like Paris or Paris. I can't remember. At the bottom, a small group of dirty men were arriving at the buildings. They made big arm gestures. One of them raised his balaclava slightly to be heard from afar. But he cried something incomprehensible. The idiot. Look at the man who is taking care of the optical instrument. With this fog he will burn his lungs. I won't pity him when I see him spitting blood. So go down to get the news, old man. The other man nodded and opened the roof trap. He went down and closed it above his head. He walked into a hallway where pipes doused him with water as he passed. Undressed in a small warm room, washed his hands and drank a glass of a pink liquid. He gargled, spat into the sink, and looked down at the back of his throat in a mirror with an open mouth. He shrugged and entered a large room where other men were arriving one by one, and went to warm their backs against a radiator. "So," he said. One of the arrivals made a tired gesture, he announced. "The ropeway is done for a long time. A quarter of a hill of rock. The pylons have been swept away over 500 meters. They are making a nice pile of scrap to collect from the bottom of the gorge. So they're cut off up there. A little. To get to them, we'll have to climb the north face. The helicopter." The other cut in sarcastically. "The helicopter. The helicopter. Would you go? You with the helicopter? With the wind and the eddies that would hurl you into one of the 3 peaks. I guess the boss is sick, they say." "Yeah, I know. And since we're all pretty much in love, with Martha we'll be going to the north face. 2 days of vertical climbing. 2 days without taking off your helmet. Not to mention the descent. Does that ring a bell, guys? On the way back, there will be some frozen feet and burned lungs. But what wouldn't we do for Martha, huh?" Chapter 2. Joachim and Martha had been sitting in the small locker room adjacent to the funicular tunnel for hours. They were waiting. Martha hadn't loosened her grip on the handrail since the storm. From time to time, Joachim would descend to the iron bridge and peep over the cable for a swing or a motor spark signaling the arrival of the wagon. But nothing. He turned and sat down by the young woman, extinguishing his lamp. The power had not come back on. In the darkness, the scholar was holding his ear open. He could imagine with terror the monstrous, horrifying monster in the guardroom. He believed he heard at any moment the slither of a snake of flesh in the twists of the labyrinth, and the silent company of Martha tightened his heart. He was trying to warm the young woman's frozen hands by holding them in his own. She let him do as he pleased, inert, as if without a soul. He recalled in his mind the whole adventure of his departure from Venus, of his arrival here, on this earth where he had lent a hand to an impious world. This failed gigantic experiment freed him from all stupid religion. It made him mature and released him from the taboos that had been incumbent on him since childhood. He could finally judge with a free mind the validity of some Venusian precepts. All science was dangerous. Though he may have thought differently once upon a time, it had to be admitted that tampering with the cell was as dangerous as meddling with the atom. On this point, the High Prudence was right. But Joachim blamed the High Prudence for having erred by excess. If the Inspector Priest had not pestered him about frogs, he could have gone further with his work, and would not have been helpless against the twins. High Prudence should have been called Holy Fright. It was in the hands of a timid council. He deserved to see the emblem of the sword replaced on the front of her temples by that of an ostrich hiding its head under its wing. That's the truth. She fought science with restrictions. Ridiculous. The best way to fight was to attack. Defensive strategy had never brought anything but disaster. Fighting the dangers of science? All right, fine. But in attacking, that is to say, in encouraging the scientists in their research instead of hampering them, Joachim cursed official obscurantism. He felt an almost rageful regret when he remembered the humiliations he had suffered. He was treated like a child, and one should not be surprised that the child revolted under too rough a yoke. And all the mal was coming from this rebellion. Suddenly he stiffened. He heard something in the corridor, some sort of intermittent slipping on the concrete floor. It creaked along a wall, stopped, scratched the floor imperceptibly, moved closer. Moved closer. You'll not move anymore. His companion gave a slight sigh and wanted to remove her hands from the unconscious grasp of the scientist. He gripped them tightly with all the force of his terror, but that groan released him from his freezing paralysis. He felt for his lamp and rose silently. He took a step toward the door. The furtive slip-up started up again, closer this time. Joachim walked down the hall, fear in his legs. He bumped into the door frame and almost screamed. He quickly turned on his lamp and saw a small white spot fluttering a bit, as if it were in wing. In a slight breeze, paper, simply folded paper. Joachim leaned against the wall, taken aback by his weakness. He wiped away the cold sweat from his forehead. When he had calmed down a little, he bravely walked to the corner of the corridor and lit it up for about 50 meters. He didn't see anything. On his way back to the changing room, he picked up the paper which had caused him to be frightened. He recognized it. The folded sheet must have fallen from his pocket, where he had quickly put it before leaving. It was the draft of his epigraphical work. Here died Pyrrhine, daughter of Bebrix, mother of a serpent. He longed over the second part of the text. Thus ends the reign of a new all-powerful race. Across the room tragically spread the hasty writing of poor Ugo. It doesn't make any difference to them. I don't understand. This small piece of paper was a bit of recent past. Evidence that all this wasn't the dream of a madman. A new all-powerful race, said Joachim aloud. He shivered and crumpled the paper in his hand. He still listened to the echoes of the corridor. He noticed that he was cold to the bone, and felt a nostalgic pang for his room, where Ugo had rekindled the fire with an armful of wood. He looked at Martha, whose eyelids blinked in the lamplight. He asked, "How are you feeling?" She didn't respond, but Joachim distinguished in her eyes such distress that he was moved to tears. Martha seemed to him all thin and fragile, crushed by a huge and cruel fate. Something broke within the scientist's heart. He felt in his heart a flow of long-suppressed tenderness. He sat down next to the young woman and gathered her in his arms. He leaned down and kissed her forehead, then spoke words he would have never dared say to the old Martha, the proud princess of the Pores. "My wounded little bird, I will save you. You'll see. I'll take you very far away, heal you, and I love you, Martha. I've loved you since our first meeting, but I didn't know it yet. Let me tell you and tell you again, though this admission is quite ridiculous coming from an old man, but I will always watch over you as a father watches over his daughter." He cradled her in his arms for a while. He repeated, "I love you. My greatest joy will be to die knowing that you are safe." "Oh, yes, I will do everything to save you. It was ridiculous." He knew it well, but this confession gave him a burst of youthful energy, and there was no one to laugh at him. Not even Martha, whose mind seemed lost in some mysterious dimension. He put on boots, put on a raincoat with transparent hoods, and wore gloves. After a moment's thought, he had Martha stand up and dressed her the same way. Docile, she submitted to it. He installed it on a bench and said, "I'll be back." He descended the steps leading to the funicular's landing stage. His boots echoed eerily on the metal, bouncing sinister sounds off the tunnel wall. He slid down the rocky slope, towards the mouth that cut a half-circle of hazy daylight some 100 meters below. In 5 minutes he was outside and hobbling down a wet slope where his boots slipped on round pebbles. He followed the cable car's cables, bent from pylon to pylon until they reached the edge of a precipice. Further on, he almost fell off a cliff. It was impossible to go any further. He stayed there for a moment, immobile above a foggy sea. He still made out 2 pylon. He could barely make out a third. Then he screamed, "Help!" but his voice carried poorly, muffled by the hood. He made a fatal gesture and exposed his face to scream at full volume, "Come save Martha! Oh, down there, can you hear me? Oh!" and panting he breathed in the lethal moisture of the air. He shouted in the mountain until he was hoarse. Then he climbed the slope heavily, stopping every 10 meters to catch his breath. As he approached the tunnel, he saw a yellow sliver of a limpet, as big as an arm, which crept slowly away, spitting on the gravel. And suddenly he heard a cry, or rather, something like a jerky laugh, and it came from the bottom of the tunnel. Her first thought was, "Martha." He caught his breath, stepped under the dark vault, and lit his lamp. He imagined the young woman struggling with. Exhausted, he crawled onto the platform and lay prostrate on his stomach, with a taste of blood in his throat and a pounding in his ears. He stammered, Martha!" And he climbed the stairs on all fours like an animal. He found the wardrobe empty. The voice ululated further down the corridor. It was small, demented giggles accompanying an ancient song, a primitive one expressing all the morbid legends of bygone times. Around the black castle, around the black castle. Castle. All the doors are well closed. Why? And the bushes no longer have roses. Stumbling, Joachim stood up and walked down the hallway, placing a hand on his pounding heart. He wanted to call out to Martha, but his voice was now just an exhausted whisper. Yet Martha's song echoed strangely through the twists of the maze. In the deserted castle, all you hear is the wind howling why, and the bell tolling the hour. Joachim hurried along with all his might as an old man. He followed the uneven wear on the pavement that had guided him in the opposite direction. He passed 3 intersections, and the voice, already distant, seemed to come from behind. At the end of a long corridor, there's a big candle, shining bright. Why? A gold cross on the wall sparkles. Joachim turned back, frantic. Martha had wandered into a maze of galleries filled with collapses and dead ends. He could call out, "Martha!" And the vault seemed to play keep away with this panicked call. "Tha! Martha! Tha! Tha!" The cry made 3 turns through the maze and returned by 2 galleries at once, to the left in front, to the right behind. Joachim turned on himself and butted against a stone slab. The lamp quickly cast green moss and dirt from the ancient walls. It fell to the ground, reduced to a small, dim light, cut off at the angle of a wall, cruelly lighting up a heap of crawling larvae on the abdomen of a spider. With his gloved hand, Joachim took back his lamp. The spider was indeed dead. To its articulated size, a broken chain segment could be seen. Joachim's face lamp blinked on, and he sighed loudly. A few centimeters from his boots, the floor ended abruptly at the edge of a black square well. Dazed, he placed his hand on the wall and then immediately withdrew it. He had touched something soft, something alive whose muscles quivered under his fingers. He stared, but the thing was already gone. He heard shuffling behind a pile of rubble. "A rat. I bet it's a rat," he said to himself, ruling out worse possibilities. He backed away from the well. Strange. He would have sworn he'd gone that way before. But no, it was impossible. How many times had he turned around? Where had he come from? He called out to Martha again. A small hiccuped laugh came back to him from far off, then much closer. He could not rely on this acoustics which twisted distances. He advanced at random. He had cold sweats thinking that Martha was walking around in here without light. Suddenly he heard it again. Somewhere to the right, not very far away, he was sure of it this time. She sang another verse of her crazy song. On a golden bed, the beautiful queen is lying why? Her crown is made of withered flowers. "Martha," cried Joachim, "stop this ridiculous singing, my little girl. Speak to me. Speak calmly." The echoes confused any possible direction. "Martha!" He crept cautiously into the cul-de-sac, and at the last moment he realized that an irregular crack had opened on the side. He fell in, scratching his raincoat on the stones, stumbled over a heap of rubble, which got into his boots to some extent. The mad voice was heard behind him. "Her eyes are all hollow. Her beautiful body is a pile." As Joachim had turned around, he saw Martha sitting in a corner. Her hood was ripped and hung from her shoulder, and her hair was full of spider webs. Her head bobbed uncomfortably to the left, then to the right, then back to the left. Under the harsh light of the lamp, she held her hand in front of her eyes and repeated, speaking more than singing, "And his beautiful body is a pile of bones, Dominus benedicat vos." Joachim recognized the characteristic consonants of this language from Lazio that he had dug out of old books. He slid down the slope, and the rubble filled his boots a little more. He sat himself down near the young woman. She stared at him, blinking, and let out a piercing cry that echoed through the maze as it bounced off the corners of stones, broken up, and rang far away, from vault to water. "Martha," Joachim said, hugging her. "Martha, calm down." "It's Joachim, Martha," she stammered. "Why?" "What?" The biologist said before he remembered that this word was part of the old song. Martha repeated, "Why? The queen has been dead for years, and the wind weeps at the doors." Then she began to sob quietly, exhausted, terrified, and desperate. Joachim nearly cried with her. His lips trembled, and he held her tighter to him. Chapter 3. Martha had withdrawn into her docile silence. Joachim couldn't tell how many hours it was that he had been pushing, supporting, carrying her almost through the dungeons. He was desperately seeking an exit. The lamp was dimming, so he lit it only when in danger or at every fork in the road. Most of the time, he felt his way forward. He had already lain down to sleep twice. But to do this, he first bound Martha's new fuga by tying her with torn straps from his raincoat. He felt extremely weak, and thirst was tormenting him. He saw the moment coming when he would let himself die. Alone, he would have given in. His love for Martha was his only source of energy, a fading source, now no more than a thin trickle of intermittent courage. Suddenly, hallucinations began. Bright spots danced in the shadows, then clear spots in a sort of grayish blur. Heavily disoriented, he gazed at the damp walls, the debris of earth and rubble. He turned off the lamp and began to climb up a sandy slope in the dark. His left hand was tight around Martha's frail wrist. After about a minute, the hallucinations returned. It was a gaudy spot atop a rock slide, a spot that twisted and grew as Joachim climbed the slope. No, it wasn't an illusion. There was light, dirty, mournful light staining rot-stained rocks. Wonderful light, out of breath. Joachim reached the ridge. He sat Martha down and peered through an uneven crack. He saw an almost entirely intact corridor on the other side. The light came from very far away, but it didn't seem that there were any other obstacles in the way. The crack was too narrow to allow a passage. Joachim dug through the sandy soil with his hands. He rolled stones from the other side, widened the opening, and shook loose some. More rocks with his boots. Then he took Martha by the hand and pushed her ahead of him into the passageway. They rolled together on the other side of the debris. They lay there a long time, recovering their limited strength to traverse 100 meters, until they came to an opening that was clearly visible from here. The funicular, Joachim thought. The car had probably been waiting for us this long. "We'll find men on the gangway, men." He got up, grabbed Martha by the arm, and walked towards the light, supporting the young woman. He gathered his strength and cried, "Ho!" But as soon as he reached under the veranda, he felt his heart tighten. At his feet, He saw the log cabin clearly marked from a panel that had been unlocked. He raised his eyes and recognized the familiar architecture of an archway. He stood on tiptoe and stuck his head through. The laboratory tipped to one side. Sinister, the slab said right into his face. New race, all-powerful. A new, all-powerful race. The missing characters gave the formula an evil aura. She would have said it with the mouth of a witch breached dent. In the lair of the monster, Joachim whispered. He looked at Martha. Always beautiful, although her eyes were puffy. She had a slightly lost look in an indifferent face. Oddly, the spider webs in her hair made her look like a wedding veil. Let's go. He breathed. He took her under the arms and tried to lift her up. But she didn't respond well to his effort. They both fell back into the pit. Joachim sat down for 10 long minutes. He caught his breath again. Finally he stood up and went out alone, wedging the tips of his boots in the cracks of the wall. Then, on his belly, he reached out his hands to the young woman. She didn't seem to see them, and he called to her in a half-voice several times in succession. Martha, take my hands. Come now, Martha, we must get out of here. Can you hear me? She finally did as he asked, with an air of indifference, and it took the biologist's muscular energy, fueled by his love for her, to pull her onto the floor of the laboratory. Joachim staggered towards the door and held his ear to it. He heard nothing, or rather, something even more terrifying. He perceived a silence whose thickness had the quality of an extremely grave dies. He felt a heavy, horrible, and sovereign presence. Waves of fear invaded all his flesh. His teeth started to clack spontaneously. Half paralyzed, he had trouble controlling his muscles to close the door shutter and push the bolt. He returned to Martha and noticed that the young woman was having the same trouble. He helped her sit down in a chair, trying to make as little noise as possible. He went to fill a glass at the tap and jumped when he heard the loud hissing of running water in the pipes. He handed the glass to Martha, but she didn't seem to see it, and he had to push the rim against her mouth. Quaking, she sipped clumsily, choked, and coughed. The glass shattered on the floor with a deafening noise for the biologist's acute senses. He remained immobile for a long time, fearing he had drawn malevolent attention to the lab. Then he went to quench his thirst in turn by drinking in his hand, like a savage. He wiped his lips and turned his eyes toward his room. It almost fainted seeing the open door on a triangle of shadow where something was sparkling. Slowly he approached, crossing the whole laboratory with a mechanical pace. He entered the room, and, bending down, recognized the golden cut of an harmless volume. He let himself fall, sitting on the bed, and remained all alert to every sense, plunged in a half-awake torpor where all notion of time was lost. At the other end of the laboratory, through the open door, he saw the little figure of Martha, motionless in her big armchair. The sun cast an unhealthy light on the slabs through the lead-glazed windows. This light slowly turned over the hours, lighting up one after another, the jars lined up on the large table, as if marking one after another the phases of the satanic experiment. The tap that was not tightly closed counted the seconds with a chattering drop by drop in the pottery of a sink. The light from the corridor slowly crept further and further along the hallway, brushed against the door, and then died out suddenly. Everything was left as just gray, sad shadows. Fear of the night pulled Joachim out of his immobility. He got up and lit 2 kerosene lamps, after unsuccessfully trying the electric switches. With gentle care, he wiped a wet cloth over Martha's face and brushed away the spider webs that soiled her hair and clothes with his hand. She seemed calmer, and Joachim managed to get some food into her. Like a child, he offered her small bites from a can of imported Venetian food. He ate it himself and, a little reassured, returned to the book whose golden spine had scared him. He picked it up, opened it at random, and was amazed that he had never noticed it before. He must have dropped it in the rush of leaving the night before. He didn't understand much of the text, which seemed to sing the praises of a very ancient God. But a sentence caught his attention. "Lord, you know what is old and what is new. You have trained me, and you guide me as with an arm." The old psalm did him good. He felt like the brother of men and of yesteryear, who drew comfort from the protection of a paternal God. He turned some pages and read, "The Lord is my lamp. He saves me. Who shall I fear? May a whole army line up before me. My heart will not be dismayed." And Joachim revolted against his fear. He marveled that the author of the book had found pure and naive phrases to boost his self-confidence. He thought of the great being revered by the priests of Venus. He thought that these priests had not loved him well, that their religion was all restriction. There was nothing but fear and prudence in it. The great being must surely prefer hardy and enterprising men. He cursed himself for doubting his existence. What did the name he was called matter? This supreme force. The ancients called him Lord, the Venusians, great being. And after, wasn't it the same? Joachim realized that one could be both a materialist and believe in hidden forces. Could you see the wind? Could you see thought? Yet these things existed. He was aware of listing disconsolately naive arguments, but words were for him only music without importance, to illustrate the genesis of an intuitive conviction. He imagined the Lord as an immense reserve of moral energy, like a quasi-cosmic force that everyone could use by means of catalytic words. Auto-suggestion. And after. The term reassured his rational tendencies, but it was nothing impious, nothing shocking for a spiritualist. He found it difficult to concretize his thought through logical reason. But he suddenly wondered why he was trying to express in human language the immense certainty that overwhelmed him. He felt a sudden contempt for the empty debates between free-thinkers and narrow-minded religious believers. He despised the fawning obscurantism of the high prudence as much as the foolish gloating of some fervent atheist. He whispered to me, "Lord, you lead me by the hand. What can I fear?" And in speaking, he made a little fun of himself. But this Lord, this fantastic entity, this God, like being made fun of while being invoked. Did this contradict his benevolence in any way? He had the impression that a large and immense friend on a cosmic scale was giving him a conspiratorial wink. He realized he was humanizing the Supreme Being a little too familiarly. Again. And after. He took a lamp and, with a firm step, walked towards the corridor door, pulled the lock. He opened it. Chapter 4. He walked down the corridor. There, despite himself, he began to gnash his teeth. A cold sweat ran down his spine. Mentally, he repeated the phrase from the old book, like an exorcism against fear. Certainly, the fear remained within him, but it was balanced by a sufficient dose of courage, and he continued to advance towards the guardroom. And when waves of horror assailed his nerves, he fought them with waves of faith. At the last bend in the corridor, he leaned against the wall, trembling leg. His teeth clicked so violently that he heard an echo under the vaulting of the still invisible room. He thought hard. Lord, what will I be afraid of? And he took the final step. Mass was there. The Mass. Yes. The Word had formed beneath his skull in the shape of that vague mass of flesh. A monstrous mass of human flesh, roughly conical, in the middle of the room. The relief of the long serpent that had coiled upon itself regularly before welding its rings together could still be seen a little, and it pulsed in places. It was alive. This distorted itself a little under the naked skin, like the belly of a pregnant woman, and phosphored with a violet-like fire similar to that of the shimmering worms. Terrified, Joachim dropped his useless lamp. The object rolled down from the foot of this living hill, and the biologist did not dare pick it up. He saw the mass grow on a point. A bubble popped up on the surface of the dough as it was baking. Something emerged from the hole. Some kind of appendage that slowly stretched out, like a snail's horn, and gradually pointed at the biologist. In a panic, Joachim took a step back and pressed himself against the wall. The end of the appendix protruded under his nose, and presented to him as a rapidly growing flower at the end of its stem. An eye. A horrible naked eyeball without eyelids or orbit. The eye gazed at Joachim for a few seconds, then it retreated into the appendix, which itself retracted into the luminous mass. A second bubble popped on the pyramid of flesh. Joachim watched as a crack appeared bordered by pink lips. A mouth. The mouth smiled, revealing young white teeth. It spoke in a childlike voice. "You're radioactive, Joachim. But at this point, it doesn't matter." And the scientist recognized the twins' voice. But already the mouth was pinching, no longer than a slit, whose edges were melting together. It no longer existed. A new appendage was born of the mass. It extended like a snake, crept quickly towards Joachim. The scientist gasped in horror and ran to the laboratory. He ran in the shadows, banging himself against the walls. Almost falling, he ran again towards the rectangular patch of light, indicating the refuge door. He reached it. At the last moment, he turned his head and saw a luminous serpent advancing towards him like a lava flow. He leapt forward, pushed the door violently away, and locked it. He went to Martha's chair, electricized by the approach of the monster. The young woman clacked her teeth, too. Joachim said mechanically, "I am here, Martha. Do not be afraid." And then he kept repeating, "Lord, what should I be afraid of? Lord, what should I fear?" And yet, with eyes bulging, he saw the serpent slim through a crack in the door, swaying a little like a trumpet. Forming an eye, withdrawing it, replacing it with a finger. That pulled the lock. The snake slunk back through the crack. It vanished, but the door creaked open slowly. A massive light appeared, pushed out a pseudopod on the laboratory floor. Joachim embraced Martha, but she was stiff as a board, paralyzed with fear. Under this awkward burden, the doctor stumbled and fell on one knee. The cold sweat that beaded his forehead ran in rivulets down his nose, blinding him. With one hand he wiped his face and let go of Martha, who rolled onto the ground. He remained frozen. The monster's appendix swung open, forming a mouth similar to the one that had already spoken in the guardroom. It said, "Don't be afraid, Joachim. I only have good intentions. I could have rammed the door. I preferred to open it so as not to scare you too much." Joachim swallowed his saliva. He licked his lips and blew. "Get out!" Around the mouth, the deformable appendage at will swelled into a ball, germinated 2 eyes, a nose. It was the head with black hair of a smiling twin sister. This head still said, "You see, I try not to scare you. Taking this human aspect does not present any usefulness for me. I do it only for you, Joachim, to calm you down." "Go away," repeated Joachim. The head had a clear and benevolent laugh. It lost almost all its luminescence and was almost human. "Go away," she said. "To please you, I could obey, but time passes. Look at Martha. She's nearly dead of fear, and that isn't an exaggerated expression. In fact, she is really on the verge of dying. I have to take care of her. Joachim saw the whole crowd swelling like a high wave on the sea. He backed off, bumped into the long table, and knocked over bottles which shattered on the floor. The wave crashed down upon Martha's lying body and buried her under it. "Martha!" Joachim screamed. "She's," said the human head. "She is safe, on the contrary. Don't be afraid for her. I took her just before her last breath. She lives in me. She's part of me, but I don't need her clothes." Joachim saw a heap of rags emerge from the side of the monster and slide to the ground. He recognized the waterproof jacket and the long coat and dress of Martha, all wrinkled and frantically clutched at the table edge, so that his nails broke on the wood. His boots slipped on the plasma of broken vials. He stumbled to one side. On soft legs he ran to lock himself in his room. He pushed the bed in front of the door and fell again on his knees. He let his head fall into the blankets to smother sobs. The bedding was still impregnated with Martha's scent. Something hit the door, a voice said. "Open up then, Joachim." "Go away," the sage repeated for the third time. But his throat only emitted incomprehensible sounds. "Master, what need I fear? Master, what need I fear?" The voice went on. "You are praying, Joachim, you are right. But you aren't used to it. It doesn't help you perfectly." "Too late. But who cares? Listen to me well, Joachim. Once again I could slam this door. I won't do that. I'll talk to you through and you'll understand." The sage plugged his ears and cried out, "Lord, Lord, Lord!" The voice spoke louder. "Well, well, well. But you're crazy, Joachim. I thought your soul was better tempered. Do you think the Lord helps those who lose their minds? He loves piety, not frenzies. Lord, Lord, Lord! Oh, great being!" "Well then," the voice said, "I ram the door down." "No." The wood creaked. Chapter 5. The boards gave way. A cord of luminous flesh flowed on the bed. Joachim leaped backward and rushed to the window. Faster, the mass stretched out an extension to the left to block the road for the scholar. The door flew into pieces. Joachim fell in a corner, hands over his eyes. But the light cast by the monster was so strong that the scholar could make out the skeleton of his fingers through his closed eyelids. Horrified, he lowered his hands. He saw the stretched mass as a river in the moonlight running along the whole length of the lab. It overflowed into the room and slowly formed a ball at the end of a flexible extension. The ball shaped itself into a face, lost its luminescence. It was Martha's head. "It's horrible," said Joachim. The head smiled. "Horrible, you say? I thought you were in love after all. Ah, I know what scares you. It's the length of this neck. We're going to fix that." The head receded as the appendage shortened, and Joachim had before his eyes the sight of Martha taking a river bath, alone. The head protruded from the spread mass like a luminous puddle. "Is it better like this?" said the head. "You see, Joachim, I have taken the form that has the most attractions for you." "You're not," said Joachim. "Oh, but yes. I am not just Martha, of course, but the head that is talking to you is hers. I have a fantastic metabolism. I can gather cells of my choice at a furious speed and rearrange them as I please. Listen well, I even have Martha's voice. I've recreated Martha. She's the one speaking, Joachim. Can you hear me? I'm no longer mad. I've never been so lucid, and I ask that you trust me." The young woman's face had a radiant expression. Her eyes shone with happiness. The scholar had never seen her like this before. Even at the birth of the twins, Martha hadn't seemed so happy. She spoke. We were the unintentional artisans of a marvelous mutation. For centuries and centuries, human protoplasm had been waiting for a particular conjunction of chances to bring it one step closer to perfection. Listen to this passage from an old text. You have traveled the path that goes from the worm to man. What is the monkey to man? A painful shame and an object of ridicule. What will man be to the Übermensch? A painful shame and an object of ridicule. The author of this text had anticipated this fantastic transformation, but it remained little clear in his mind. Übermensch. This awkwardly crafted word was still too rudimentary. It would have been necessary to say over humanity or find an even stronger word. But even words will soon be useless. Human protoplasm will absorb all others. Life will no longer be one. We will absorb the trees and beasts. I don't understand, said Joachim. Martha replied, It doesn't matter. You'll understand soon. Just know that the venom of a reptile has affected my daughter's genes. But our practices were needed to give birth to a new being, more powerful and perfect than man himself, who is nevertheless called the King of Creation. Perfecter, said Joachim. These demonic twins were neurotic monsters. They were evil, and we... Joachim, you talk without thinking. They went through an ungrateful age before their merger into a single organism. Their cruelty, the murder of their sister, was just a form of self-realization. At that time, we would have killed them if I could have kept a normal lease. They felt it. After that, it was too late. They had become too strong. A sure instinct and a powerful tropism pushed them under the radioactive rain of the storm. In fact, they caused this storm by a phenomenon that would be too long to explain, and the mutation was complete. The times have come, as Shadan said. The sorcerer of Deimos Town. And now it's your turn, Joachim. You have breathed dangerous fumes for your little human body. You are on the verge of the grave. I must absorb you and save you at the same time. No, groaned the biologist as he crinkled up in his corner. The head smiled wider. That was Martha's face, all right. Of a Martha transformed by a bath of youth. Of a Martha more attractive than ever. She said, Shilyan. By me, I mean the new being. Like all young beings, I want to play. I want to engage in a free activity. I could absorb you without your permission, but I want you to take the first step. I will seduce you, Joachim, and you will jump into my arms of your own accord. No. Oh, but yes. Martha's face slowly rose towards Joachim. Round and delicate shoulders emerged from the river of luminous flesh, then white arms. A soft young torso was before Joachim, in a state of dazzling nudity. Martha seemed like a mermaid with a large, brilliant tail. She extended her arms. Oh, she said, I offer you my life to die for and be born again immediately. Embrace me. It's monstrous, said the sage. I'm just an old man, and you've never held a woman in your arms. I want your death to be delicious, Joachim. We'll be one in an instant. Either way, you're lost. I'm offering you a living death. Joachim stood up and hugged the corner as if he wanted to get into stone. Martha went a little bit higher towards him. She said in a persuasive voice, "Your shyness is ridiculous. Soon, morality and sexuality will mean nothing. Kiss me." The enchanting face was very close. Some sort of ecstasy was born in Joachim's eyes. His lips trembled. He leaned abruptly over Martha and felt dizzy. His arms hugged the captivating silhouette. His lips touched a silk-soft cheek. He was taken aback by an explosion of happiness, and he no longer existed. All his delighted cells perished in a sea of bliss. The monster retreated to the laboratory. It left a small pile of empty clothes in the room. Chapter 6. One by one, the men emerged from the depths of the abyss. One after another, they made a final tug and climbed to the top of a large rock that jutted out next to the castle on its north side. There were 5 of them. There, they looked up at the giant silhouette of the towers. Exhausted, they took a moment to catch their breath. Then one of them made a sign, too tired to speak. He moved along a narrow, slippery ramp. The others followed him, roped and with a heavy resignation. With their hoods on, they looked like a procession of ghosts. They rounded the corner of a buttress and were buffeted by the west wind, making the panels of their raincoats flap like wings. One of them stumbled. His boots slipped towards the void. Without the rope, he would have fallen to his death. They reached a gate and entered without difficulty into a passage full of debris. At the end of 20 meters, they came upon a wooden palisade. Through the cracks, one could see the beginning of a small staircase. They began to break down the obstacle with pickaxes. The monster heard the loud thuds reverberating through the castle's bowels. Stroking his luminous flesh at the top of a flight of stairs, he waited. When the noise stopped, it flowed in a cascade to the lower landing, divided into 3 and disappeared through 3 different passages, a small spiral staircase, a kind of a ventilating pipe a little to the left, and the slope of a corridor that had been depressed by centuries. The men moved along a corridor. They had thrown off their hoods. The last man carried the rolls of the long inutile rope over his shoulder. They had hollow eyes and a face carved by the fatigue of climbing. One kept coughing incessantly. Another limped pitifully and used his pickaxe like a cane. Suddenly, the first one stopped short, and his comrades butted into each other behind him. "Fire!" in a ragged voice. But no, it was not hot. It was a soft and plastic mass, like dough that rolled slowly towards them, a luminescent blob of flesh that crept along at a fatal pace. And eyes were forming here and there on this mass. Human eyes sprouting like mushrooms all over, suddenly appearing, and then disappearing to be replaced by other eye lumps. One does not know which man cried out in terror. They crowded back at the other end of the gallery. One of them stumbled across and fell. The flaming mass was on him, touched his contorted face in horror. He disappeared, as if sucked from his sudden empty clothes. The others ran without turning around. They began to run down the stairs leading to the gatehouse. 2 of them, pushed by the others, dove headfirst into a second bright mass that rose to meet them. The survivors turned around and crossed just in time between the 2 masses, which joined together to roll after them. The slowest one was caught up. His scream stopped suddenly, silencing himself with his disappearance. The last man was fighting for his life in a corridor. At the first turn, he slowed down and clung to the wall. Another mass was approaching him. He frantically searched for an escape route as the bright constriction tightened on either side. Gasping, he repeatedly licked his lips. He raised his pickaxe, threw it with all his strength at the nearest mass. With a spark, the pickaxe bounced at his feet. The man was hypnotized by 100 gazes. The eyes sprouted, grew, popped like bubbles, reborn, drew closer. They waited. He felt all his flesh dissolve into a whirlpool of light, and immediately he was happy. Happy as walking in step with the friendly crowd of many comrades. A strange choice. He knew that he was no longer anything, or rather that he was both himself and others, united in a collective safety, lukewarmness, and power. Mass slid down the mountain slope. It flowed like water, split on the edge of rocks, reformed lower down. Ardaslud, that nest, a leaning tree over the void. She seemed like a vast eraser wiping out life. She made a snowball. As she approached the cliffs, she spread out like a gigantic wing and soared in the invigorating mist. She melted like an angel of destruction on the buildings, cleansing them of all their inhabitants by seeping through the tiniest crevices. She went lower down where 2 interplanetary rockets were waiting to take off. She broke up into pieces. The biggest one went towards the sea, a vast reservoir of life for its gigantic appetite. The smaller one entered the rockets, absorbed the pilots and technicians, was filled with eyes, ears, hands that pressed the buttons commanding the start. A rocket left for Mars via the moon. The other launched an elongated orbit that curved onto Venus's orbit. And later, rockets would become obsolete, like crutches to an old, infirm man. Mass would absorb iron and rock. Would the mass itself become a rocket and naked leap from planet to planet all on its own until it reaches the outskirts of the universe, feeding on everything, light and matter? She will stretch out to all galaxies in her relentless quest, purring with collective bliss, where every animal and plant cell would sing in harmony the same awe-inspiring chorus. And all of this I know since I received Martha's visit, for I saw the sign in her agonizing daughter's eyes. I saw the sign announced by the thaumaturges of Deimos and the prophets of Sunk. So, I prepared the sanctified water by extinguishing a sacred ember on it. Then I poured the sanctified water onto the altar of Morin Sass, and I saw all the story in the sphere of CG. In truth, I say to you, I saw all the story and wrote it down in this book. Why did I write it down? I had nothing more to do while waiting for what is to happen. And strange echoes already come from Venus. The navigators tell us that this planet is ravaged by a luminous sea, and most people raise their shoulders and talk about hallucination or superstition. But I know the exact second where. Hold. I hear the crowd murmur outside as my window glows with a purple light. It sounds like a storm of terror, and me alone, I know that the mass is over the city. I saw it in the sphere of Sayeg, Mi Shadan, the dole of Deimos town, the last sage heir to the ancient practices. And Hadaya, times have come. Hedadiah, time has. Endediah, time has